A few weeks ago, political commentator Ezra Klein featured Ta-Nehisi quotes on his New York Times podcast, The Ezra Klein Show.
Well, it's good to see you, man.
Good to be here, Ezra. Thank you.
All right, well, let's jump into the disagreement. You wrote a column responding to my column on Charlie Kirk.
So uncomfortable.
It's okay.
Frankly, I haven't been able to get their conversation out of my head since I watched it. And to be fair, it seemingly wasn't just me. The episode briefly became its own mini flashpoint online because it so perfectly seemed to capture the broader tension within American liberalism that's been simmering for the past several years. I mean, you could practically hear the gears grinding as Klein tried to articulate the Democrat Party's eternal quest for the mythical, reasonable center voter, that guy who lives in an Applebee's and just wants everyone to get along.
Saying that kind of playing politics is needed.
Well, Coates very patiently kept trying to explain that this framework has repeatedly failed to produce any material change for the people who actually need the most help.
I can give you an example from the other side, by the way, too.
Yeah, go for it.
Brother.
And I think this exchange became a strange sort of catharsis for many of us because Coates kind of inadvertently ended up becoming the proxy for all of us who are simply tired of having this same conversation over and over again as we have for the past few years.
When I hear Ezra Klein talk, I'm like, is he even aware of like how he's coming off? Well, I don't know if he's even aware of it.
Ezra Klein is saying makes any sense.
It's not even strategically practical.
There was major backlash from, I think, many communities of color to see this like very prominent Democratic, like liberal pundit whitewash this racist. It was a bit, I don't know, shocking, I guess.
So many of us are just tired of having to explain the same danger and be told to our face that, you know, if you could just find the right clever argument, the forces of fascism would just sit down and nod thoughtfully and just agree to be less fascist and think over what you said. And in the face of being confronted with that from Ezra Klein, Coates just ended up being all of us staring at the camera like we're Jim in The Office.
That's fine, I'll take it. But I want to put this on you for a minute, right?
Sure.
You keep sort of putting it back on me.
Yeah, I'm open. Go ahead.
You keep putting it back on me here on the Ta-Nehisi Coach Show.
Yes, right.
What then should we do?
But all of that is not why this conversation has lingered with me. I've been annoyed by the failures of centrists for years now. That's not new. What did stick with me, however, was what felt like this crack in Klein's usual rhetoric. Like I could actually begin to see the human being underneath the policy wonk. For all the many issues that I have with him, and I will get to those, there was something earnest happening between his words here. Something that sounded like a man starting to have to question beliefs that he spent his entire life assuming were unshakable.
I don't know what my role is anymore. I'll be totally honest with you, man. I feel very conflicted about that question.
And I recognize and empathize with the feeling that Ezra Klein is having, this inability to know where you're going. Because I went through something very similar myself almost a decade ago. It's a cognitive dissonance that I think is underscoring the anxiety of so many earnest centrists right now. Not the cynical grifters who perform it for power or profit or attention, but the ones who I think genuinely, desperately believe, like Klein, that there's still a balance to be found between right and left, even as fascism openly takes root. But watching them, and in particular someone like Klein, only just now really truly begin that reckoning internally at a moment when the stakes could not be clearer is frankly frustrating to watch, I think, for many of us. But what unsettles me most, and the reason that I wanted to talk about this today, is that while I empathize with Ezra Klein and many like him who are finally starting to wrestle with that tension, there's also a part of me, cynically, that believes that they fundamentally cannot dream of a way to cure the wound at the heart of this country. And that if he and others like him cannot collapse this dissonance, ultimately he's going to help maintaining the very world that is devouring us all.
In every American community, you have varying shades of political opinion. One of the shadiest of these is the liberals.
You have gotten a lot of attention in the last few years. Very often people in the Democratic Party wanting to know what Ezra Klein thinks.
An outspoken group on many subjects. 10 degrees to the left of center in good times. 10 degrees to the right of center if it affects them personally.
What is your sense of your mission?
Sure, once I was young and impulsive. I wore every conceivable pin. Even went to socialist meetings. Learned all the old Union hymns. But I've grown older and wiser.
I have lines what I think should and should not be acceptable, but those lines clearly have no relationship to my country, the politics.
Yes, I read New Republic and Nation. I've learned to take every view.
I want to talk about the Kirk episode specifically because I was a little surprised at how conciliatory you were to him.
Yes.
Have you listened back to that? Do you have any regrets about not pushing
none.
back?
We can go in our little corners. We can act like the other side doesn't exist. We can start doing litmus tests to everyone that walks down the street and wants to get a selfie.
Okay, let me push back though. Charlie Kirk said stoning gay people is God's perfect law. That's not like a litmus test of sort of just like general political policy disagreements.
We engaged in a civil dialogue, and I extend that to everyone I've had on.
But when it comes to times like Korea, there's no one more red, white, and blue.
What's happening right now in Gaza, what is happening to the Palestinian people is outrageous, and it breaks my heart.
And let me be clear, I will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself, and I will always ensure Israel has the ability to defend itself.
I love Harry and Sydney and Sammy. I hope every colored boy becomes a star. But don't talk about revolution. That's going a little bit too far. So love me, love me, love me. I'm a liberal.
I don't know what my role is anymore. I'll be totally honest with you, man.
So love me, love me, love me. I'm a liberal.
Hey, before we get started, I just want to quick shout out my Patreon. I've got some exclusive videos up over there about Star Trek, Lower Decks, Babylon 5, and a few other things that you can only get there. But also, you get your name and videos and things like that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, Patreon is what helps support me doing what I do. And just being frank, bills have not been easy lately. So if you can do anything to help me over on Patreon, it would mean a lot. And you get yourself cool stuff. But beyond that, on with the show. Klein invited Coates onto his show after Coates wrote a response in Vanity Fair criticizing an op-ed that Klein wrote for the New York Times in the immediate aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination.
In the hours after Kirk's murder, trying to process my own shock, I wrote a piece about him.
And I want to first dig into that op-ed to really get at Klein's perspective, so we can see why he even wanted to discuss it with Coates in the first place. The op-ed, which was originally titled Charlie Kirk was practicing politics the right way, has since been retitled Charlie Kirk and the Right Way to Practice Politics after public backlash to the op-ed. But if we're being frank, that original title feels far more honest about Klein's underlying worldview, because in the piece, Klein essentially argued that Charlie Kirk's brand of politics was deeply admirable, in form, if not in content. Klein essentially cast Kirk as a symbolic figure embodying civility who thrived in that most sacred of arenas, the marketplace of ideas.
In that piece, I said, you can disagree with virtually everything Kirk believed about politics. You can detest some of what he believed about politics and still believe that he was there on that stage, practicing politics the right way.
Klein was not trying to endorse Kirk's ideology, but he was romanticizing Kirk's supposed commitment to open civil debate, basically casting his public clashes and campus events where he debated college students as a model of civic engagement.
There was something that I respected in what Kirk was doing, like going in, having debates, using them opportunistically. A lot of people have thrown back at me that, oh, he wasn't debating to find truth. Of course he wasn't debating to find the truth. He was doing politics. He was trying to persuade people.
Kirk, in Klein's eyes, used persuasion instead of violence, embodying in his mind liberal democracy's greatest power, its ability to sublimate conflicts like war into a simple dialogue. A Hegelian dialectic where friction between two opposing ideas creates a synthesis between the two that will inevitably continually push towards progress. This is the premise beneath liberalism's end of history myth, the belief that embodies the final, most rational form of civilization. A system that helps us humans transcend the need for physical struggle and conflict, and one that is destined only to refine and perfect itself forever, leading us ultimately to even greater and greater prosperity. And maybe even eventually some far-off utopia, a city on the hill that we will eventually reach if we just continue following the liberalist system.
American politics has sides. There is no use in pretending it doesn't, but both sides are meant to be on the same side of a larger project. We are all, or most of us anyway, trying to maintain the viability of the American experiment. We can live with losing an election because we believe in the promise of the next election. We can live with losing an argument because we believe that there will be another argument. Political violence imperils that. Kirk and I were on different sides of most political arguments. We were on the same side on the continued possibility of American politics. It is supposed to be an argument, not a war. It is supposed to be one with words, not ended with bullets.
And this is where I want to kind of make a clear distinction here. Liberalism as a term can mean a lot of different things depending on who's saying it right now. On the right, it's often a catch-all slur for anyone to the left of Ted Cruz, or a shorthand for big government in some vaguely defined culture war sense. For many on the left, liberalism can just mean anyone that they think is less revolutionary than they are. Philosophically, liberalism itself emerged as an idea out of the Enlightenment era around the idea of individual liberty against the constraints of community. A worldview built on the sanctity of private property and ownership as the means to secure that individual liberty.
You lay the evils of slavery at the feet of the king, but you say nothing of slavery itself, sir. Now, surely, if the trade is outlawed but ownership is not, then those unfortunate Negroes still in servitude will become a more lucrative commodity.
Well, that's not what I intended, Dr. Franklin.
And while I will touch upon all of those things, especially that philosophical definition, what I'm really talking about here isn't liberal philosophy in the abstract. I'm talking about liberal democracy as a system, the political and cultural structure that defines itself by procedure, civility, and the illusion of balance, all in service of supposedly uplifting those individual liberties. These definitions, of course, all influence each other in different ways, but this is the main one that I want to contend with. Klein contrasts this romantic image of Western liberal politics with what he calls political violence in his op-ed, a term he explicitly and narrowly defines as physical attacks on political actors like politicians or pundits such as Charlie Kirk. In both his op-ed and later on his podcast, he uses recent examples of assassinations and assassination attempts to underscore his definition of political violence, narrowing it specifically to something exceptional and personal rather than systemic or structural.
One thing I wrote about in that piece that I do worry about is I worry we are already in a cycle of political violence, of mimetic violence. I think about Pelosi, I think about Shapiro, I think about the near assassination on Trump.
So by setting up this contrast between liberal democracy's supposed ability to contain violence and what he defines as political violence directed at public figures leads to his ultimate argument, which isn't that Kirk's politics were good, but that attacks on people like Kirk represent a deeper, more existential crisis for America and liberal democracy itself. A threat to the very foundations of this country, so much so that he states that America is about to, quote, lose everything.
The foundation of a free society is the ability to participate in politics without fear of violence. To lose that is to risk losing everything. Charlie Kirk and his family just lost everything. As a country, we came a step closer to losing everything too.
His fear, ultimately, is an existential one, that the nation is abandoning what he sees as the best form of politics we have, one based solely on reason and persuasion, to instead regress into a world where only force remains. But while this was ultimately Klein's conclusion in his op-ed, most of the backlash to his essay instead focused more on his evidence, specifically his claim that Charlie Kirk's politics were somehow good. Numerous critics, myself included, pointed out that while Kirk may have performed civil debate, the words and policies he championed were anything but. His rhetoric seethed with hatred towards Muslims, trans people, queer people, Jewish people, black people, immigrants, and numerous others. He trafficked in conspiratorial anti-Semitic and white supremacist myths like the Great Replacement Theory, and was an outspoken defender of Israel's genocide in Gaza.
I used to say that, hey, if you as a gay person would go to Gaza, they'd throw you off of tall buildings, right? Now they don't have any tall buildings left, so I don't... Is that too soon? I'm sorry. Maybe you shouldn't kill Jews, stupid Muslims.
It's hard to watch a clip like that and argue that Kirk was doing anything civil, but he was using the exact civil platforms liberals like Klein romanticize in order to spread rhetoric that was violent in everything but form. But to Klein, form is everything that matters, not the values that go behind it. Which was ultimately the main criticism that most people had, and Ta-Nehisi Coates perfectly encapsulated that main assertion in his essay rebuttal to Klein.
Political violence ends conversation and invites war. Its rejection is paramount to a functioning democracy and a free society. Political violence is a virus, Klein noted. The assertion is true. It is also at odds with Kirk's own words. It's not that Kirk merely, as Klein put it, defended the Second Amendment. It's that Kirk endorsed hurting people to advance his preferred policy outcomes.
Coates here is basically indicting Klein's impulse to try to separate Charlie Kirk's assassination from his politics, in order to try to deal with them as completely separate issues. As if the reaction to the horrific violence used to end his life can be dealt with separately from the larger context of Kirk's actions while he was alive. Indeed, that was a central pillar of Klein's argument.
I've seen two forms of reaction to Kirk's assassination that are misguided, however comprehensible the range of horror that provoked them. One is a move on the left to wrap Kirk's death around his views. After all, he defended the Second Amendment, even admitting it meant accepting innocent deaths. Another is on the right, to turn his murder into a justification for an all-out war, a Reichstag fire for our time.
Klein here is essentially treating these two reactions as equally dangerous. Criticizing Kirk's role in normalizing, propagandizing, and working to legitimize authoritarian rhetoric to Klein is just as harmful to democracy as the Trump administration using Kirk as a martyr in order to consolidate its own power.
He was assassinated because he lived bravely, he led boldly, and he argued brilliantly without apology. He did what was right for our nation.
And I think most of us would agree that this is a wild false equivalence, right? By Klein's own comparison here, the Trump administration is exploiting Kirk's death in ways that he says echoes the Nazi Party's usage of the Reichstag fire of 1933, where Hitler's party blamed communist agitators for the arson of the German parliament building to secure emergency powers and suspend civil liberties, and suppress and ultimately eliminate the Communist Party that was its main political rival at the time. And while certainly there are differences between these two events, we're seeing similar tactics unfolding right now. Kirk's assassination has been weaponized to try to vilify trans people as terrorists.
I think a lot of people were just waiting to see if it had gone down that avenue as well, and if there was some kind of a trans connection, because we've seen so much violence from that kind of flank of the left. And then when he said that, I just was like, ding, ding, ding. It just kind of hit that nerve again.
As well as create a culture of silencing journalists who challenge the administration, and on top of that, expand state control over the media. Obviously seen when FCC Chair Brennan Carr attempted to indirectly pressure media conglomerates to silence mainstream TV personalities like Jimmy Kimmel, who are viewed as critical of the administration.
I mean, look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. These companies can find ways to change conduct, to take action, frankly, on Kimmel, or, there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead.
Even his funeral became a political rally, with figures like Stephen Miller working to redirect rage at his death toward a conveniently undefined they that can be used to justify using the apparatus of the state against anyone the regime chooses.
The light will defeat the dark. We will prevail over the forces of wickedness and evil. They cannot imagine what they have awakened. They cannot conceive of the army that they have arisen in all of us. Because we stand for what is good, what is virtuous, what is noble.
Yet Klein treats both of these political reactions to Kirk's death as equally troubling, because to him, they are. What Klein's ultimately really trying to protect here is his comforting illusion of an American system where all violence is neatly contained within debate. He refuses to see state-sanctioned violence as political violence because he can't. Because if he did, he'd have to admit that the system that he romanticizes isn't a shield against brutality, but a wielder of it. Because it's important to understand how Charlie Kirk and authoritarians like the Trump administration argue for their rhetoric and policies to be implemented. Because it's not about lone wolf violence, it's about calling for state-sanctioned violence. Kirk openly called President Biden a corrupt tyrant who should be put in prison or given the death penalty.
A lot. I mean, Joe Biden is a bumbling, dementia-filled Alzheimer's corrupt tyrant who should honestly be put in prison and or given the death penalty for his crimes against America.
Which is a direct call for the state to punish a political opponent, which Trump is now doing by targeting his critics and perceived enemies like former National Security Advisor John Bolton, FBI Director James Comey, and New York Attorney General Letitia James. Kirk also, just a few weeks before his death, celebrated Trump's deployment of federal troops in Washington, D.C., even urging the administration to go further. He pushed for the federal banning of transgender healthcare nationwide and the repeal of gay marriage and abortion rights to enforce heteropatriarchal norms. Kirk also celebrated the usage of ICE agents to unilaterally arrest racially profiled immigrants without trial to enforce a white supremacist state. This is political violence, but carried out through the machinery of the state, through legislation, policing, and the courts. Kirk's entire project was about enabling a movement bent on targeting anyone outside its imagined moral order by weaponizing the cultural norms of traditional family, white supremacy, nationalism, and patriarchal strength that are embedded within much of the American system. Because all of these actions were not about suddenly revamping the system, it was about stripping away the thin reforms that softened its edges and revealed the brutality that was always at its foundation.
It's the founding fathers. They are the ones that gave us this system, and it has been abused and challenged. They've tried to create a super governmental government on top of the three branches of government, the administrative state. And it shows that if a small group of people can dedicate themselves to righteous and noble causes, that things can improve.
Trump's fascism didn't invent that, it just stripped away the nominal checks and balances and expanded on the fundamental building blocks of American systemic control. Just done widespread through the impersonal apparatus of the state, not through individual actors like someone trying to assassinate another person. Thus, are seen as equally a problem because they disrupt this illusion of the neutrality of the liberal democratic system. And that rupture to the myth creates a cognitive dissonance that is on full display in Klein's conversation with Coates. Because before we even start the podcast proper, Klein does one of his typical introductions that he does before every episode. And it's clear from that his chief concern right from the start of this podcast is to emphasize his belief in the power of the American dialectic.
I think it'd be the height of hypocrisy for me to say we need to reach across divides and disagreement and then not talk across my own. So I wanted to talk to Ta-Nehisi about the piece, about the aftermath of Kirk's murder, but also about a disagreement, or a question at least, that I think is about more than Kirk. I think there's something very unsettled in the sort of broad coalition of the left around the work of politics, around who we talk to and when and how. When is that work moral? When is it necessary? When is it a betrayal?
Already, Klein has subtly framed the podcast we're about to watch by simply him choosing to have a political conversation with Coates over a disagreement that they have as evidence of his thesis that civility and dialogue can create a larger consensus, a microcosm of America's strength in his eyes. But this framing already reveals a core problem, right? Klein gets to choose the guest, the framing, and even the tone of the so-called debate on this issue. He's not inviting a radical leftist revolutionary to challenge his views on Kirk, he's bringing on a friend, someone who operates within the same general media and intellectual ecosystem as him. I mean, he even later admits that he and Coates regularly text and chat with each other about issues like this, which is fine. Klein can speak to whomever he wants to on his podcast, it's his show. But Klein in this introduction is presenting Coates as a representative of the entire broad coalition of the left, which lets him subtly define the boundaries of how far we're allowed to imagine the coalition and criticism here. The conversation becomes the illusion of the marketplace of ideas, but Klein has already indirectly determined what wares are available for purchase in that store. Consensus is curated by the boundaries of who is allowed to be considered worthy of being part of the dialogue. And we see him underscore his desire to reinforce and perform American civility when he opens the conversation with a justification to Coates, framing the piece as an empathetic gesture done towards those earnestly mourning Charlie Kirk's death.
For me, the immediate hours after somebody is murdered in public, when you see that sort of grief and horror pouring out of the people who loved him, and many people loved him, my instinct then is to just sit with them in their grief, right? To say, I can, for this moment, find some way to grieve with you, to see your friend the way, or in some version of the way you saw him.
Klein presents his supposed sympathetic gesture of writing the essay as an apolitical, moral, humane response. Him standing above partisanship and appealing to a shared sense of American community. Which, by the way, only gives fuel to the right-wing argument that those critiquing Kirk's, and indirectly their, politics were anti-American and thus needing to be silenced.
Right? That's not my view of, the person's whole legacy. But going to people when they're grieving like that and saying, listen, I want to tell you really what I thought of your friend. Just feels like not what you do in a kind of a community.
And to be very clear, I do believe that many grieved Charlie Kirk sincerely, especially many of the conservative or moderate young men that dominantly made up Kirk's primary audience, who I think felt an earnest ache at losing someone who is a role model to them both as a man and as a political actor. But those very emotions were exactly what Kirk's movement preyed upon in his life. His entire project was built on radicalizing young people to far-right ideals through the performance of civil debate owning the libs as a supposedly neutral political tool of persuasion. The empathy Klein describes doesn't transcend partisanship, it reaffirms the very narratives that enabled Kirk's influence in the conservative movement in the first place. And this is what Coates tries to confront Klein on. That on an individual level, yes, it's a good thing to empathize with people's grief. But Kirk was not a neutral actor, and Klein trying to treat him as such actually helps to legitimize Kirk's deeply harmful arguments and ideology.
I had to be honest with you. That's when it got really, really difficult. When I went past my initial impressions and started going through all of the clips of the things he said, the way he talked about people, the way he, described groups in ways that honestly, even as I was writing it, I was uncomfortable saying. And so the idea that this guy should be in any way celebrated for how he conducted politics. The fact that he just slurred across the board, all sorts of groups of people, and then ran an organization wherein, which appeared to me just a haven of hatred. I would not want that to be a model for my politics.
And when Klein tries to push back on this, Coates also points out the power that Klein's platform as a political writer and public voice gives him to reinforce the harm Kirk's life and now death enabled.
I do think there's just something about when violence takes hold that that there's something about it that it begins to breach all lines.
Yeah. So
anyway,
I guess
that was part of my reaction too.
I think all of that is understandable, but I guess was silence not an option?
This is ultimately a really simple point that Coates is trying to make here, right? He's pointing out that there is a difference between personally holding space for someone's grief, which we can and should do if we're able and we care about somebody, and a political pundit of Klein's reach and place supposedly opposing the very harmful views and values and actions that Kirk espoused, performing this empathy towards him. Because it helps naturalize the Trump administration's fascistic-style strategy, a comparison that Klein himself made, of justifying state violence against marginalized communities in order to launder authoritarian seizing of power.
We have a First Amendment in this country. The First Amendment protects a lot of very ugly speech, but if you celebrate Charlie Kirk's death, you should not be protected from being fired for being a disgusting person.
But Klein's response to Coates here reveals something very interesting to me because it underscores that he never really earnestly cared about sitting with other people's grief, but he instead was doing it as part of a politically calculated performance.
Yeah, silence to me was not grieving with people. I felt it was important as someone who is liberal, as someone who has a voice, that there are moments like that. I really do feel, and it's funny because you said something like this in your piece, but it was a little bit more offhanded, that political violence like that is an attack on us all.
Right.
And that in that moment, it creates, for me, even if it's very temporary, that it's important in a moment like that to sort of, come together, to try to see other people in their grief, to try to cool things down just a little bit.
This is ultimately what I'm going to call thoughts and prayers liberalism. Because like how conservative politicians only offer thoughts and prayers condolences after mass shootings in order to try to remain apolitical and avoid taking political action, Klein here is performing empathy in a supposedly apolitical way, all so he can create an inroads with those he wants to reach, Kirk's audience. Klein's empathy here is ultimately a very performative but calculated political tool for outreach to the right in order to court their attention, because he believes that civility and persuasion can still work, even with those whose politics are explicitly trying to negate those very values. He is trying to position himself as some neutral arbiter that can actually try to have a conversation with these people who fundamentally don't actually want to have a conversation, but to dictate what they want.
A few days before Kirk's murder, I taped an episode with Ben Shapiro. Shapiro is well to my right, a person with whom I have many disagreements, and also a person with whom I've had good conversations over the years. I wanted it to live as it was because talking to each other about our disagreements isn't only something we should do in grief or in horror. It's just something we should be doing.
And we see how blatantly a political maneuver this empathy is, because barely a moment passes after his appeal to grieving together before Klein ultimately pivots to political calculus by asking Coates why Kirk was winning.
I guess, given everything you read that Charlie Kirk said, and we probably don't have very different views on the value of the things he said, why do you think he was winning?
Klein's ultimate goal is to try to win like Charlie Kirk, not ever reckon with or present something against what Kirk represented. Because winning for Klein has become more important over the years than the values that he supposedly should stand for.
At some point you have to win. Not everything, but you have to put winning first.
He cares more about getting power than his own values. Hell, he even admits that he envied Kirk's political influence, which is an incredibly telling statement in his essay.
When the left thought its hold on the hearts and minds of college students was nearly absolute, Kirk showed up again and again to break it. College-age voters shifted sharply right in the 2024 election. I envy what he built.
He wants to peel off some of Kirk's followers in order to prove that liberal civility can win them back, without recognizing that the very reason Kirk was winning is because he fundamentally did not believe in the same values Klein supposedly stood for, and Klein and other liberal politicians and pundits did nothing to actually meaningfully counter those beliefs or position them as unacceptable, but instead kept normalizing them.
I've got to admire what you've been able to do, not to weaponize, but to organize on these college campuses a different point of view.
Klein even brings up and plays a clip of Hillary Clinton's deplorable comment from the 2016 election to Coates in order to argue that Democrats' failure at that time until this day was writing these people off by not trying to reach out to them and just saying that they're awful, terrible people, deplorables.
I think in many ways we've stopped doing politics. We've written a lot of people off. And in writing them off, we are losing and we are unable to protect ourselves, unable to protect them, just unable to make good change in the world.
Can you say more about that writing them off, please?
Yeah. Why don't we start it here if we want to talk about writing them off? I've been obsessing recently for a piece I've been writing about the Hillary Clinton deplorables comment, and I want to play it.
It is honestly kind of wild to me to still be obsessed with Hillary Clinton's campaign nearly a fucking decade later.
They are irredeemable, but thankfully they are not American.
You can even see Coates' bewilderment too at Klein bringing it up in the podcast. Though it should be noted that Klein's framing of Clinton's comment here is removing it from its wider context in the same way that the right wing removed it from its context in order to weaponize it as a way to argue that she was supposedly vilifying all of the right wing rather than just the racist assholes that Trump was enabling and uplifting at the time. She even made a very clear distinction in her speech there, but that was taken out so people like Trump could say, hey, look, she fucking hates you, vote for me, in order to stoke that sort of populist, anti-elite rhetoric that Trump sort of represented at the time and still kind of does, despite the fact that he's been president fucking twice and is a fucking billionaire. Anyways, I just at least needed to point that out. Dear God, Klein has got me out here defending Hillary Clinton. Do not take that as endorsement of her.
How we get them to have Pokemon go to the polls.
But even beyond that, Coates admits to his credit that Clinton's deplorable comment was bad politics and not the way that he would frame it.
What do you think when you hear that?
She probably shouldn't have said it.
But you think it's true?
I mean, it's probably not how I would say it, but, you know, I mean, there are things that I would say.
Coates is arguing the point here that you need to fundamentally offer something different in order to court votes away from other people, to actually have earnest values rather than perform whatever you think is politically sellable.
The thing I'm struggling with in this conversation and even in that question is the fact that there are things that you yourself have actually advocated for that had they been done, we would be having a very different conversation.
But I think for Klein, he's so focused on that specific moment where he views the Democratic Party as abandoning the right-wing base, because to him, they were a voting bloc you could use to try to persuade them to vote for your power.
I think I want it to not be close.
You said what?
I want it to not be close.
See, I mean, you will call this my fatalism, but I am not surprised. I think it's going to be close.
And doesn't really recognize why Clinton ultimately failed. It's because she failed to confront what right-wing politicians like Trump were actually offering at the time, and still to this day. Something different than what people were already getting.
I have seen firsthand how the system is rigged against our citizens, just like it was rigged against Bernie Sanders. He never had a chance. Never had a chance. But his supporters will join our movement because we will fix his biggest single issue, trade deals that strip our country of its jobs and strip us of our wealth.
Trump and the politicians and pundits in the MAGA movement were lying, but they were saying it. They were fundamentally offering people something other than the status quo that had been hurting them. Klein keeps trying to debate a base that isn't acting in good faith because their leaders, like Trump, are pursuing a political project of power for power's sake and using the systemic tools currently available to them to do it, regardless of how much they need to lie, cheat, or bully their way in order to get there. They don't actually have any earnest values beyond power. So by constantly seeking consensus with the right, he allows them to dictate the conversation. In doing so, it lets the center slide further and further right, pulled by people actively working to drag it there. This is why Coates tries to engage Klein not as a political strategist, but as someone whose job it is to hold power accountable, as a political writer.
I just want to be clear about something. I shouldn't be running for president of the United States. You know what I mean? And my expectations for the rhetoric of writers, intellectuals, journalists, etc., is very, very different than what the expectation should be for people who expect to hold office.
Coates is saying that writers are a part of politics, but our job, and I include myself in this, is not to manage optics necessarily. It's to speak truthfully about what we see and to advocate for perspectives and the needs outside of the incentives of the political systems of power. I mean, Coates is the guy who wrote The Case for Reparations, which is an argument that he knew at the time wasn't a politically convenient one, but one that he did anyways, because he was arguing that the American government needed to finally reckon with how its institutions have worked to systemically disenfranchise Black people for centuries. He's ultimately working as a political advocate, not a politician who's meant to find a consensus based on these values, which means he advocates for policies and actions that would benefit the people he is advocating for, which in his case, generally speaking, is Black Americans, as well as at times in coalition with other groups.
I am most concerned always with those who don't have a voice, with those who don't have the ability to talk. I have asked repeatedly in my interviews whether there is a single network, mainstream organization in America with a Palestinian American bureau chief or correspondent who actually has a voice to articulate their part of the world. I've been a reporter for 20 years. The reporters of those who believe more sympathetically about Israel and its right to exist don't have a problem getting their voice out. But what I saw in Palestine, what I saw on the West Bank, what I saw in Haifa in Israel, what I saw in the South Hebron Hills, those were the stories that I have not heard. And those were the stories that I was most occupied with.
And certainly, you should try to be persuasive in doing that, into making these political arguments. That's the art part of all of this. But you advocate for your position, not simply for the aesthetic form in which you persuade, which is what Klein is doing. It's substance through style, not style for style's sake.
I see myself as someone for whom it's very, very important to state the truth plainly. and to clarify things as best I can. I'm not a strategist for the party, and I've tried to, as you raised in that Barack Obama piece, I've tried to respect the difference.
Coates then calls out what Klein's attempt to build consensus with the right wing will inherently require, an abandonment of those most harmed by the ideas the right advocates for.
You take very, very seriously the need to convince people outside of the tent right now, right? About like we have to convince them to come in. I guess what I want from you is I want you to take as seriously people who are in the tent and who are vulnerable and afraid. And if you have to convince them of something that's extremely, extremely uncomfortable, or tell them that you're taking a position that is extremely uncomfortable, I just think you owe them a little more. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah,
man.
That's fine. I'll take it.
But this doesn't seem to compute for Klein, who ultimately refuses to engage on this point about trying to actually court and listen to those that Klein tries to frame himself as in coalition with, the nebulous left, as he describes it, because he immediately pivots the conversation back to his own obsession with outreach to the right wing.
I guess I'm not pushing you to be a political strategist, right? I think that for me, something you see me doing right here, something I think people reacting to me doing is saying, well, if the fight is this profound and we're losing the fight, then the question is to think about how we fight.
Right.
That's something about knowing that this much of the country is, on the wrong side of what my line would have been.
Right.
Knowing that what Kirk was doing, what people like him were doing, was working.
Right.
That imposes a set of questions upon us that need to be answered.
Right.
But this is where Coates and Klein fundamentally diverge, because Klein isn't so much a political writer as he is a function of the system itself.
I think my job is translating from experts to people, so I'm a health policy expert translator.
He positions himself as a sober reformer, the rational policy wonk advocating for a better version of liberal democracy. And to his credit, throughout his career, Klein has argued for reform within the system, pushing Democrats to make procedural changes that would make American democracy function more efficiently. Take, for example, his focus on Senate filibuster reform, something that he's been arguing for as far back as 2012, and heavily emphasized that it's something that Democrats should have done under Biden's tenure.
The filibuster is a disaster. I cannot say this clearly enough. So basically, the minority party uses the filibuster to make sure the majority party cannot govern in a way that people can benefit from, and then the minority party runs against the fact that the majority party failed to govern. That is a terrible way to set up incentives and accountability in a political system. So even if it were not the case that this was an unusually important year for governance, we should not have a filibuster, because to what I was saying earlier, the way democracy is supposed to work is the public elects people, they get what they ask for, and then they get to judge it. The filibuster is a central reason that does not happen in our system anymore for both parties, and it has made a dysfunctional and I think increasingly toxic political system.
And I want to give Klein his due here. I think he's both right and incredibly astute in this argument. The filibuster is how both parties, and especially Republicans, have stalled any real progress and redirected public anger towards their political opponents, rather than focus on delivering any material change for people. Ending it would fundamentally shift US politics by allowing actual policies to pass. Without filibuster reform, there's going to be no restoration of Roe v. Wade, no wealth tax, no major transit funding, no national trans protections, nothing. And as Klein often notes, the filibuster wasn't even used regularly until the modern era, signaling how it has helped lead to where we currently are. But the real point here that we should be looking at is the reason the filibuster hasn't been reformed. Both parties ultimately rely on it because it allows them to govern without governing, to promise change while maintaining the stability of the system that sustains them. Neither will ultimately break it because both understand that its primary function is to prevent the real redistribution of power, which is why the current moment is so revealing. Under Biden, Republicans used the filibuster to force endless concessions while Democrats clung to the fantasy of good faith dialogue. But now, Trump is openly agitating to eliminate the filibuster, but to enact authoritarian policies.
The president posting online, "It is now time for the Republicans to play their Trump card and go for what is called the nuclear option. Get rid of the filibuster and get rid of it now."
They want to keep the mechanism only when it limits transformation and reform to the system, and abandon it the moment it stands in the way of consolidation of power for the system. Klein's focus on the machinery of governance, rather than the material foundations of who governs and why they govern, reveals the limits of his vision. Policy in the American system does not reflect the will of the people, but reflects the interests of those aligned with capital, because those are the people who get elected and whose priorities shape the political agenda. a dynamic that has always existed but only deepened in the past few decades as more and more money has been pumped into DC.
You made 3 speeches for Goldman Sachs. You were paid $675,000 for 3 speeches. Was that a mistake? I mean, was that a bad error in judgment?
Look, I made speeches to lots of groups. I told them what I thought. I answered questions.
But did you have to be paid $675,000?
Well, I don't know. That's what they offered.
Even if we look at recent history, since the Clinton administration, the Democratic Party has steadily remade itself into a neoliberal engine for capital.
The people who never voted for a Democrat, the people who had given up hope, all of them together are saying, we want our future back, and I intend to help give it to you.
Bill Clinton's presidency marked the party's full embrace of Reagan-era economics, deregulation, welfare cuts, privatization, and the financialization of everyday life. Every Democrat administration since then has refined that model, marketing technocratic efficiency and market-driven reform as progress, while quietly entrenching corporate power.
Biden spoke at a private fundraiser earlier this week and told the big donors that he didn't want to demonize the wealthy, and added that under his presidency, no one's standard of living will change. Nothing will fundamentally change.
And so, by upholding that machinery, Klein functions less as a journalist than as a high priest of establishment liberalism, a supposed outsider whose real task is to manufacture consent for faith in a system that, since its inception, channeled power through the systems of the owners of production and capital.
Yes, I would like to sign the insurance companies out of existence with my pen. It would be sweet. But it has never happened in the history of this country that we have signed a multi-billion-dollar industry employing tens of thousands of people in every district in America out in one shot.
Take Klein's recent co-authored book with Derek Thomas, Abundance, which has become the sort of script for the abundance movement.
Someone asked, a colleague of Ezra Klein's, the New York Times, asked, where's the Democrats' Project 2025? And Richie Torres, Representative Richie Torres from New York, just tweeted a photo of the cover of this book, and without any words, just said, this is my idea of Project 2025 for the Democratic Party.
The abundance movement has ultimately been trying to sell itself to Democratic politicians seeking to distance themselves from progressive populism.
The Democratic Party is flailing in the market for new ideas, and along comes abundance. So anyway, congratulations on that.
Abundance argues that the protections for the working class and disenfranchised won over the past few decades mainly by the Democratic Party, like those centered on race, gender, queer, and trans rights, as well as labor unions that have worked to protect the working class through regulation of business practices, have all ultimately hindered larger economic growth. And this lack of economic growth has led voters to feel disenfranchised with the Democratic Party.
When I look at policies in New York that stand in the way of abundance, very often, if you look under the hood, you eventually find a labor union at the end.
These problems here are being caused by fairly mainstream groups that have real meaningful clout in the Democratic Party, major green organizations, labor unions, things like that.
The solution, Klein and Thompson suggest, is to deprioritize regulations that get in the way of business, including those that protect workers, and also to deprioritize social issue policies that protect the disenfranchised, and instead pursue deregulation and market liberalization, allowing companies, especially those in Silicon Valley, to build a more prosperous America.
This book is about putting outcomes over processes. It's about setting a North Star with a big, bold, beautiful sci-fi vision in the first 3 pages of the book and saying, we can do this, but in order to do it, we have to get out of our own way.
In effect, Abundance recasts capital as the engine of collective uplift, claiming that if we empower the wealthy and capitalist institutions through policies that incentivize them to reshape our cities and industries, progress will just trickle down to everyone else, and everyone will just be uplifted at the same time, regardless of their race, class, gender, or creed. In Klein's mind, abundance is his answer to the MAGA movement, something that the Democrats could follow and push in order to win back disaffected MAGA voters who feel betrayed by Trump's failed economic promises, but remained unbothered by the movement's authoritarian cruelty to minorities, the working class, and the disenfranchised.
And so what our book is trying to do is to redefine liberalism, the Democratic Party, for an age where the Democratic Party is incredibly unpopular, but it has to be strong and popular to take on Donald Trump. But I think we have to take a good long look in the mirror and say, why is it that we've allowed the places we have the most power to become so problematic that people are leaving and we're losing power in these places?
This isn't to say that Klein doesn't care necessarily about the disenfranchised, but that he ultimately believes that we will all be uplifted in the end by these companies if we all let them just do whatever they want.
But if Democrats are to become the party of abundance, they have to confront their own role in creating scarcity. Liberals spent a generation working at every level of government and society to make it harder to build recklessly. They got used to crafting coalitions and legislation that gave everyone a bit of what they wanted, even if it meant the final product was astonishingly expensive or decades late.
This sounds vaguely familiar.
We can create the incentives which take advantage of the genius of our economic system. A system, as Walter Lippmann observed more than 40 years ago, which for the first time in history gave men, quote, a way of producing wealth in which the good fortune of others multiplied their own, unquote. Our aim is to increase our national wealth so all will have more, not just redistribute what we already have, which is just a sharing of scarcity.
So in reality, all this is just trickle-down Reaganomics for the tech oligarch generation, framing itself for the Democrats against Republican authoritarianism. Fundamentally, Klein's vision doesn't dismantle the machinery of inequality, it just refurbishes it and sells it back as optimistic bipartisanship. Abundance seeks to give more power back to millionaires and billionaires to do whatever they want.
I believe in a politics that's more oriented around a concept of liberalism that doesn't fear corporate power specifically.
I mean, before Klein and Thomas's book arrived on the scene, the concept of abundance were already circulating around Silicon Valley, and their book has been used as a way to push this ideology into the halls of political power. Revolutionary Door Project notes that the Abundance Political Action Committee Welcome PAC is funded by corporate-friendly billionaires like the Waltons, Bloomberg, and Wall Street donors such as Rob Granieri and Mark Hennessy, as well as Reid Hoffman and James Murdoch, son of Fox News founder Rupert Murdoch, who himself donated $2.5 million to Welcome PAC. Klein and Thompson even headlined an abundance conference co-organized by the Conservative Foundation for American Innovation, which is the same think tank behind Project 2025.
So much there. I'm going to try to touch on as much of it as I can keep in my head.
While some billionaires like Larry Ellison still are courting the Trump administration's favor, the abundance movement is trying to court billionaire tech oligarchs who may be frustrated by the Trump administration, like Elon Musk, who has been pushed out of the administration for trying to take control of it to benefit his own companies directly, to the Democratic Party agenda, as well as itself being propagandized by billionaires so they can set themselves up to be in a good position in the wake of the inevitable backlash to the Trump administration's authoritarianism. Elon Musk himself has already started using the word abundance to describe the type of tech company-led future that he's imagining, arguing that the billionaire class will help uplift everyone through overabundance.
It will be a world of abundance. The only scarcity that will exist in the future is that which we decide to create ourselves as humans.
And yet this supposed shift in strategy is no real shift at all. It just makes clear what has always been true. Democrats and Republicans remain aligned in their commitment to preserve the power of the elite, not to materially improve the lives of the people they claim to represent.
And I'm just kind of curious how you reflect on that. I mean, there are things that Trump is doing that are kind of, it's almost like a sick parody of your book. How do you process that?
Klein then isn't an outsider critiquing the system. He's a manufacturer of an agenda seeking to create a political framework to justify Democrats preserving the status quo of our current oligarchical order. And Klein's words have a direct effect on our politics. Klein was one of the most followed political writers among Biden administration staffers on Twitter, according to British digital strategist Rob Blackley. In this, both Klein and Charlie Kirk served the same function for our political system. They were both propagandists for facilitating the power of capital funded by capital, just on different sides of the arbitrary political divide. Turning Point USA had a total of $389 million in donations from conservative foundations and individual donors while Charlie Kirk was alive. That money made Kirk a key player in shaping political outcomes, so much so that J.D. Vance openly credited him with helping Trump-aligned candidates get elected, including Trump and Vance themselves.
He was a critical part of getting Donald Trump elected as president, getting me elected as vice president.
And so much of our success over the last 7 months is due to his efforts, his staffing, his support, and his friendship. I don't think that I'm alone in saying that Charlie was the smartest political operative I ever met.
And tech billionaires like Elon Musk, Larry Ellison, Bill Gates, Sam Altman, Mark Zuckerberg, and so many others have used the Trump administration as a chance to strip back regulations and personally benefit their own companies. Elon Musk is an obvious example, but we could also turn to Larry Ellison's Oracle, which was handed a $500 billion data center project for AI development by the Trump administration. And Trump has also tapped Ellison to buy TikTok after forcing this social media app to sell to an American business, all helping propel Ellison in just the last couple months to becoming the richest man in the world. This is ultimately why Charlie Kirk was backed. He was, like Ezra Klein in his own sphere, a propagandist for billionaires. And I think subconsciously, this is why Klein saw Kirk's death as a threat to democracy itself more than the harm caused by Trump administration's policies towards marginalized groups, like those grabbed by ICE without due process. Because ultimately Kirk was someone that Klein identified with in his tier of economic safety. Violence only becomes illegitimate to Klein when it breaches that boundary. I mean, ultimately, the final lines of Klein's op-ed make this abundantly clear. That was a pun there, accidentally.
I wanted Kirk to be safe for his sake, but I also wanted him to be safe for mine and for the sake of our larger shared project. The same is true for Shapiro, for Hoffman, for Hartman, for Thompson, for Trump, for Pelosi, for Whitmer. We are all safe, or none of us are.
That we in the final line of his op-ed isn't a we that represents the entirety of the American people. It's a we that just means the political and media establishment that serves the billionaire class. Klein even cites Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare CEO allegedly assassinated by everyone's new favorite Mario brother, as an example.
I'm a Luigi.
Showing his concern is for billionaires, not the thousands of working class, poor, and minority folks whose Thompson's company let die over denied medical bills. For Klein and many others, thousands dying is a Tuesday, but one member of their class dying signifies the end of the world. This is always the case with marginalized lives. We are always debatable.
You guys are saying if you want to be liberals, believe in liberal principles like freedom of speech, like, we are endowed by our forefathers with an inalienable rights, like all men are created equal.
Ben, we have to be able to criticize bad ideas. And
of course we do. No liberal doesn't want to criticize bad ideas.
But Islam at this moment is the motherlode of bad ideas.
Jesus.
So
I mean, just a few weeks ago, Klein had Ben Shapiro, another Charlie Kirk type who was snagged right out of college to become a mouthpiece of billionaires, on his podcast. Because every poisonous idea, no matter how dehumanizing, apparently deserves its moment in the liberal marketplace of ideas, as long as it's coming from someone adjacent to privilege and power.
The way you write about them, the scavenger's a looter, greedy, jealous, and violent. You say the scavenger's a lecher, rebellious, perverse, and leering. The scavenger's a barbarian, jealous, enraged, and violent. Scavengers who do not wish for a better world, or at least a better world for everyone. They would rather be equal in misery than unequal in prosperity. I guess let's talk about Bernie for a second. You call him a putrescent Marxist pimple on the posterior of the body politic.
The people who actually live with the biggest consequences of these issues are never invited to the conversation. And this happens not just on Klein's podcast, but all over the place within our political system, from the top all the way down. Take, trans people, for example. I know, wild one for me to pick. The current targeting of the transgender community by the Trump administration is the culmination of a project that took shape within the Republican Party at the federal level after their losses in the 2020 election. GOP leadership realized that the growing push to ban trans women from sports in state legislatures could function as a perfect wedge issue on the national stage, rooted as it is in long-standing common sense assumptions about sex segregation and so-called male athletic advantage. It was discriminatory, but it felt justifiable to not only their base, but to the Democratic base as well, because it's ingrained in our beliefs about the separation of men and women.
A lot of new records are being broken in women's sports. Hate to say that, ladies, but got a lot of new records. They're being shattered. You know, for years, the weightlifting, every ounce is like a big deal for many years. All of a sudden, somebody comes along and beats it by 100 pounds. Boom, boom.
Stephen Miller even said it outright at CPAC that very year.
This issue will help the GOP win midterms.
But the goal was never about sports. It was about creating an electable issue, as well as reasserting gender hierarchy as the natural order. Republicans don't defend institutions because they value them, they defend the hierarchies those institutions enforce because they benefit from them. Trans people are targeted because our existence exposes gender as something constructed, not fixed. And if gender can be remade, then any hierarchy can be remade. And that realization is the only true threat to authoritarian power because it's based on calls to ingrained invisible hierarchies made to seem like common sense.
What I have just described is only a small fraction of the common sense revolution that is now, because of us, sweeping the entire world.
And we've seen this same exact tactic be used before. The Nazis in the 1930s leveraged international sports organizations like the International Olympics Committee, led at the time by bootstraps American millionaires such as the US Olympic Committee President Avery Brundage, who actively fought against boycotting the 1936 Berlin Olympics despite ongoing persecutions of Jewish people, to ultimately become the first global institution to formalize strict gender verification. The Nazis used sports and the Olympics as a deliberate project to create an institutional precedent for enforcing gender norms as natural, all in service of enforcing its ideology around women, sexuality, and the traditional family.
William Knoll, the Nazi sports doctor, wrote a flurry of letters to various international sports federations. I request that all female participants in the Olympic Games should have their gender checked beforehand by a specially commissioned doctor. Knoll made no mention of testing athletes in men's competitions. In his framing, trans and intersex women were the only group worthy of concern. Knoll signed off, Heil Hitler! The letter marked a turning point in the history of gender surveillance. That sports officials would endeavor to sort people into a sex binary based on cursory medical exams was, in many ways, bizarre. In this understanding, trans and intersex women would become collateral in a campaign to impose ideals of femininity across the entire women's category at the Olympics. Decades later, this type of sex sorting would come to be an expected part of life in a gendered society. Prisons, single-sex colleges, social service agencies, and operators of swimming pools and changing rooms would all construct working definitions of male and female that present both, wrongly, as binary and stable biological categories. But in the 1930s, few regulatory bodies had yet taken it upon themselves to build out regimes of gender surveillance. That sports would become the center stage for this attempt to regulate gendered bodies is a strange twist of history.
And a lot of this information comes from this excellent book that I'm holding up right here, my very used copy of, The Other Olympians, Fascism, Queerness, and the Making of Modern Sports by Michael Waters. It's a really great book, and I'm condensing a lot of things here, so if any of this interests you, definitely check this book out, and I'll probably end up talking about it more later in another video at some point. But ultimately, for this video, the through line that I want to draw attention to is unmistakable, because Republicans today are using sports in the exact same way, to manufacture a scapegoat for their own power and also enforce gender hierarchy as the foundation of political control.
And I signed an order making it the official policy of the United States government that there are only two genders, male and female.
And instead of clearly defending trans people, then shifting the conversation towards material policies that actually improve people's lives, liberal pundits called trans inclusion in sports a losing issue.
And it doesn't help trans people at all to have these extreme positions. Oh, yeah, don't test anyone, just take their word for it. I think it's terrible politics.
It's not an extreme position. It comes from a position of human rights, and it does help all people. It's not a human right.
And they treat it that way because trans people in sports means that we have to fight against deeply ingrained cultural assumptions around natural, common sense gender differences. Assumptions they have no interest in ultimately challenging because these assumptions also stabilize their own access to institutional power. So they argue we should quietly set the issue aside, even as the right escalates it in bad faith. Then, liberal politicians like Pete Buttigieg and Gavin Newsom pick up that framing, insisting we must have good faith dialogue with people who are actively, intentionally weaponizing this issue to consolidate their own power.
That does call into question some of the past orthodoxies in my party, for example, around sports, where I think most reasonable people would recognize that there are serious fairness issues if you just treat this as not mattering when a trans athlete wants to compete in women's sports.
Meaning the parent who's complained about this has a case, in your opinion?
Sure.
Democrats are still protecting the same underlying structure, the one that prioritizes stability for capital and for those already in power.
Saying you've got at least 40 billionaires with ties to the pharmaceutical industry, other big money interests. He's basically saying you're bought and paid for. How do you respond to that?
And I welcome that support, no matter how they voted in the past, no matter if they've got a lot of money or not. I want their help because, let me tell you, Donald Trump and his allies right now are doing everything they can to hold on to power. Yeah. They just raised $25 million in a day. We need to go into that fight with everything that we've got, and I'm not going to define my campaign by whose help we reject or whose support we turn away.
The system only accommodates trans people so long as we don't disrupt its hierarchies. So trans suffering is framed as unfortunate but acceptable collateral, a necessary part of the process.
Sure.
Our lives become the bargaining chip used to maintain the comfort of the powerful. Yet, we can also see this dynamic even more clearly in how transness has been attempted to be wielded and recuperated into the liberal narrative of progress through Delaware House Representative Sarah McBride.
I know how much this win would have meant to me as a young person, as I faced a crisis of hope and wondered whether the heart of this nation was big enough to love me too. And
McBride operates within the American system as a symbol of the liberal ideal of gradual inclusion. As the first openly transgender person elected to Congress, she's framed as proof that the long arc of history bends towards justice and inclusion. But that narrative depends on a racing context. McBride was born into relative wealth in Delaware and began her career close to political power, working, pre-coming out as trans, as a staffer for Governor Jack Markle in 2008 and for Delaware Attorney General, the late Beau Biden, Joe Biden's eldest son, in 2010. After coming out as trans in 2012, she was even given overt public support from Beau and Joe Biden soon after, them even calling her part of the Biden family. Further, McBride fits well into the visual and gendered ideal of liberal womanhood. She's white, upper class, well put together. Her version of womanhood translates well to that sort of Hillary Clinton-style model for women in politics. None of this negates her accomplishments, but it highlights how her story fits safely within the boundaries of establishment politics. She represents a version of trans progress that is legible and respectable and has access to money, a story that most trans people don't have. I'm about to be very, very critical of McBride, but to at least be fair to her up front, she has at times used her position to advance protections for trans people throughout her career. Before she was an elected official as a member of the Board of Equity Delaware, she helped lobby for legislation prohibiting discrimination on the basis of gender identity and expression in employment, housing, insurance, and public accommodations. Later, as a Delaware state senator, she sponsored the Healthy Delaware Families Act, which expanded paid leave reform in the state, which would help not only trans people, but many working class people in Delaware, though there were criticisms of the act overall. Her work, especially at that level, is not without merit. However, since being elected to federal office, McBride has increasingly given credence to the idea that trans people must accept second-class citizenship and trust that the system will eventually recognize our full humanity. We saw this almost immediately after she was elected. Soon after McBride won her election campaign, sufferer of J.K. Rowling's Black Mold Rot, Republican Representative Nancy Mace, introduced a bill banning trans women from using women's restrooms on Capitol Hill, an explicit attempt to target and ostracize McBride.
Is this effort in response to Congresswoman McBride's coming to Congress?
Yes, and absolutely, and then some. I'm not going to stand for a man, if someone with a penis is in the women's locker room, that's not okay.
If being a feminist makes me an extremist or a bigot or a monster, I am totally here for it.
Shortly thereafter, Speaker Mike Johnson enacted a similar ban. Yet while a dozen trans activists, including Chelsea Manning, organized by Gender Liberation Movement, protested the ban with a bathroom sit-in in the Capitol, in contrast, Bride's response to this blatant targeted discrimination was compliance with the order, saying that she would follow the rules.
I'm not here to fight about bathrooms. I'm here to fight for Delawareans and to bring down costs facing families.
McBride's ultimate argument here was that she wasn't in office to fight for trans rights, but to represent her constituents in Delaware. But in doing so, she stopped acting as a person with rights worth defending, and instead subsumed herself into a symbol for the system itself. She made herself into a cog meant to prove the system's moral coherence.
I would like my approach of respecting everyone to contrast with the disrespect that we are seeing right now.
Her role isn't to challenge its failures or demand dignity for her own personal self, but to perform faith in its purpose. She ultimately is performing this belief that if you just play by the system's rules, it will eventually reward you with the liberty and equality that it preaches. Maybe not now, maybe not even in your lifetime, but sometime in the long arc of history. That's the pseudo-religious heart of liberal civility. The belief that the system is greater than the people within it, even greater than its own stated ideals of individual liberty and the pursuit of happiness for all. But she also came to symbolize something else, because for many in the trans community, McBride showed that even the most visible trans person would trade dignity for decorum. And on a human level, many of us, including many trans people, understand that McBride likely calculated that as a first-term representative, she didn't have the political capital to take on that fight, not even for herself. But that's exactly the problem. She chose to participate in this machinery. She literally ran to represent, to be a representative, to symbolize.
I hope this win sends a message to young people across the country that our democracy is big enough for them too. That regardless of the results at the top of the ticket, we all have a place in our country. We all belong.
By being pressured, though, both culturally and systemically, to immediately compromise her own humanity as a trans person in service of civility to the system, it furthers the narrative that the American system is more important than the people it claims to value. A faith that Johnson and Mace ultimately exploit so they can push even further with state control over policing gender and ultimately reinforcing the traditional heteronormative family. As we can clearly see with Nancy Mace literally tweeting out 80s era homophobia now.
I want to make sure that no men are in women's private spaces, and it's not going to end here. This shouldn't be going on any federal property. If you're a school or an institution that gets government funding, this kind of thing should be banned. I think it's sick, it's twisted.
This, sadly, is a repeated move for McBride. On September 19th, 2025, McBride, along with 95 other Democrats, voted yes on a resolution brought by Speaker Mike Johnson that would honor
the life, leadership, and legacy of Charlie Kirk, whose steadfast dedication to the Constitution, civil discourse, and biblical truth inspired a generation to cherish and defend the blessing of liberty.
McBride explained her vote by saying,
I disagree vehemently with so much of what Charlie Kirk said in his life, and I disapprove of parts of the resolution that I believe misrepresent his work and his words. But I chose to vote yes, because I believe there must be no mistake that I condemn violence in this moment. And that is what the heart of this resolution is about. We could debate language, but at its core, it was a statement about political violence. People really need to expand their definition of political violence.
So McBride willfully compromised her humanity to perform civility towards someone who denied her own very right to exist as herself in his life, all to uphold the supposed morality of liberalism. Hey Sarah, I just want to let you know, the leopards will still eat your face too, dear. Earlier this year, McBride appeared on Klein's podcast to discuss her views on trans rights and how to, quote, make change for LGBTQ people. And the conversation made clear just how deeply her faith in the system runs.
I truly believe that liberalism, that our ability to have conversations across disagreement, that our ability to recognize that in a pluralistic, diverse democracy, there will be inevitably people and positions that hurt us. But when you're siloed and when you suppress that opposition underground in that basement, to use your word, they're alone in there. And not only does that sense of sort of community loneliness breed bitterness, but it also breeds radicalization. Liberalism is not only the best mechanism to move forward, but it is also the best mechanism to rein in the worst excesses of your opposition. Yes, the compromises, you don't get to do everything you want to do, but that is a much better bet than the alternative, which is what we have developed now, which is an illiberal democracy in so many ways, in our body politic.
To me, this is a really grim statement. She's essentially arguing here that bigotry and harm are inevitable features of any system, something that we just must accept as part of human nature. This is both cynical and ahistorical, but it's something that has been propagandized to us by the capitalist and liberalist system itself. It plays directly into the idea long embedded in Catholic and Western thought, that humans are inherently sinful beings and need higher structures, whether it be God-given divine morality or a liberal democratic structure, in order to keep us in line. It's the same underlying logic that fascists weaponize, that we as humans just need to give ourselves to some greater, more important system, and ultimately kill any human being that does not fit within the confines of what that system needs in order to function. Liberalist democracy doesn't go that far. It still makes overtures to multiculturalism, but ultimately it is trying to create a hegemonic assimilating process. But like Klein, McBride believes that participating in liberalism will, over the long arc of history, rein in the worst excesses of those who oppose your humanity. So if by some random happenstance Sarah McBride happens to be watching this, I'm asking this to you very earnestly right now. What excesses has your acquiescence to the system curbed right now? Please do tell, because from where I sit, things only seem to be getting much worse.
And I think there should be more amendments regarding gender-affirming care, you name it. Castration is not a mistake, by the way. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to say that castration is health care, and there's nothing more dehumanizing than going after the trans out there. One recently shot 2 young school children in Minnesota. It is a mental illness, and it needs to stop, and we can stop it in our military right now. So
it seems as if trans people, and you specifically, Sarah, have only become more dehumanized as we wait for the system to hand us rights through our participation in acting as if its treatment of us is in any way acceptable. Throughout the conversation, though, McBride agrees with Klein about things like how trans rights, such as trans people's right to play in sports, for example, without discrimination, are compromisable because they don't poll well. They don't win.
We now have to say and fight for and push for every single perfect policy and cultural norm right now, regardless of whether the public is ready. And I think it misunderstands the role that politicians and, frankly, social movements have in maintaining proximity to public opinion, of walking people to a place. We should be ahead of public opinion, but we have to be within arm's reach. If we get too far out ahead, we lose our grip on public opinion and we can no longer bring it with us. And I think a lot of the conversations around sports and also some of the sort of cultural changes that we saw in expected workplace behavior, et cetera, was the byproduct of maybe just getting too far out ahead and not actually engaging in the art of social change making.
That statement captures the essence of gradualism, the idea that equality should arrive only when the larger public is ready for it, that equity should wait its turn in line. But the result of that thinking is always the same. Marginalized people are asked to sacrifice themselves for the comfort of those who already hold power over and over again. Wait your turn. Things will come eventually, and that eventually never does arrive. In reality, McBride's just giving right-wing conservatives a weaponized argument to say that even trans people admit that they went too far, and justify the right-wingers to go even further.
There's been a lot of trans retrenchment, if you ask me. I mean, it's kind of interesting. We haven't been able to cover it, but trans identification is at record lows already, basically proving it's a social contagion. Sorry, yes, that's correct.
Look, I want to make very clear here, I agree with McBride and Ethan Klein that conversations matter. You should be trying to reach people if you can, to humanize yourself and others, to try to have hard conversations and to ultimately build coalitions and empathy. That's the work of politics, as McBride points out. She clearly understands that part. But the problem is, you don't need to platform hate to have a conversation or educate. My work, and many others' work in the trans community and for other marginalized communities, have participated in these conversations without platforming hate as a reasonable position. Because it's fucking not. But McBride and Klein's approach make it sound like it's compassion to sit in the room while someone argues that your life is worthless.
I now recognize the representative from Delaware, Mr. McBride.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
As if patience is the price of being allowed to simply exist. And that's not kindness. Because what's really happening is that they're centering the comfort of the already powerful, the people who have always been listened to and always been protected, and that our culture makes us incentivized to hear more of.
One, creating room for disagreement, assuming good intentions, assuming that the people who are on the other side of an issue from you aren't automatically hateful, horrible people. I think it means creating some space for disagreement within your own coalition. I think it's a kindness that just feels so missing from our body politic and our national dialogue.
That's not consciousness building. That's maintaining power. The moment you agree to debate your right to exist, you've already conceded that your existence is negotiable on some level, that you can be part of a person, and that all we're doing now is just determining how much of a person you are. Are you 1/3 of one, half of one, maybe even 3/5 of one? Advocacy starts from self-definition, not compromise. But what's so frustrating with their limited imagination is that there are so many other ways to fight, ones that we can even see happening right now within the system. The success of Zoran Mamdani's recent political campaign showcases that you don't have to build a political movement based on appeasing capitalist aims or fascists, but instead work within leftist and marginalized and disenfranchised and working class communities to navigate friction and disagreements between them without ultimately abandoning each other. That is the actual hard work of politics, to try to navigate friction and build up a thing that helps everybody. Mamdani's recent unapologetically pro-transgender ad, the kind of direct, proud affirmation no establishment Democrat has ever had the backbone or courage to make.
We can't bring Sylvia back, but we can honor her memory by building a city where trans New Yorkers are cherished.
Or his unapologetic anti-Zionist stance, paired with a clear commitment to supporting Jewish communities within New York, even in the face of bad faith smears that conflate his anti-Zionism and Muslim identity with anti-Semitism, exemplify this.
And I must ask Congressman Jeffries, how many more Palestinians must be killed before you call for a ceasefire? How many more?
Mamdani demonstrates what solidarity actually looks like, what it means to fight for people, not power. It's also so refreshing to see that he always mentions that he's part of a team, trying to turn away our society that venerates individuals to make them symbols of a movement, and instead point to the larger community.
You know, for all of the focus on rallies, on commercials, on debates, it really comes back to people speaking to other New Yorkers about the city that we all love. We have 90,000 volunteers right now.
Mamdani's team has worked to navigate the lines of friction generated by the powerful, like those between Jewish people and Muslims, while continually calling out not only Trump and the authoritarian right, but also establishment Democrats like Cuomo, who wield political power for their own self-interest and economic gain rather than justice.
We are in the 9th consecutive year of more than 100,000 children in the New York City public school system being homeless. That means it began when Andrew Cuomo was the governor. And what did he do? What did he do about it? He did not do anything. He spent more money on a singing water fountain at LaGuardia Airport than he did on the average cost of an affordable housing unit. That is the record that we have in display, and what we need is a change in this city, not more of the same.
We've seen this dynamic play out very recently, with Cuomo's open deployment of Islamophobia as a campaign strategy, utilizing ingrained biases of power in order to try to smear his opponent.
God forbid another 9/11. Can you imagine Mamdani in the seat?
Yeah, I could. He'd be cheering.
It's another problem.
It reveals just how deeply the Democratic establishment is invested in policing identity to maintain its own comfort and power, not trying to create a better status quo. Zoran himself then spoke about this, how in running he initially tried to avoid becoming the Muslim candidate, believing that assimilation was the path to being seen as legitimate, to become a symbol for all New Yorkers that is palatable to everybody by sublimating his own selfhood.
I thought that if I could build a campaign of universality, I could define myself as the leader I aspire to be, one representing every New Yorker, no matter their skin color or religion. I thought if I worked hard enough, it would allow me to be that leader. And I thought that if I behaved well enough or bit my tongue enough in the face of racist, baseless attacks while returning back to my central message, it would allow me to be more than just my faith. I was wrong. No amount of redirection is ever enough.
Right there, he is pointing at the same pressures that McBride had upon her when she was asked to say that she would follow the law in terms of abiding by the bathroom ban in the Capitol. This pressure to become a symbol of the system that sublimates yourself for everyone else's benefit, even your own self-worth and your community's self-worth, because you're ultimately upholding the auspices of power rather than advocating for people. So when Zorhan now says he wants to center his Muslim identity unapologetically, it's a direct rejection of the assimilatory elite capture logic at the core of establishment democratic politics.
There are 11 days remaining until Election Day. I will be a Muslim man in New York City each of those 11 days, and every day that follows after that. I will not change who I am. I will not change how I eat. I will not change the faith that I am proud to belong to. But there's one thing I will change. I will no longer look for myself in the shadows. I will find myself in the light.
It's a refusal to be a symbol for the system itself, sublimating himself in order to be deployed for its benefit. It's choosing selfhood over being an ornament of diversity used to stabilize the very systems that would prefer him to disappear. I say it again, you begin with full personhood and build outwards from there, building coalitions who will stand alongside you in that, as well as your own values that you are stating plainly and clearly. McBride and Klein reverse this, starting with compromise, asking for recognition on terms the systems find comfortable in hopes for that recognition to grow in the future. McBride argues that trans people asserting our own needs and autonomy unapologetically is a form of its own authoritarianism, equal with the forces currently wielded by the right wing to control others' autonomy.
You can't have absolutism on the left or the right without authoritarianism.
She even argues that LGBTQ rights or abortion advocates are purity politics.
I think when we have this sort of purity politics approach to LGBTQ issues or abortion, what we communicate, even if we're not talking about those issues, is we communicate those are threshold issues and therefore the voter reads that as those are priority issues. And the only way to convince the voter that those are not our priority issues, that that's not what we're spending our capital and time on, but rather giving them healthcare and housing, is to make it abundantly clear to people that our tent can include diversity of thought on those issues.
I mean, what does purity politics even mean with abortion rights? Especially when you consider that abortion rights are literally a winning political issue even by the terms of the Democratic Party. Her argument is basically, don't fight for abortion or LGBTQ rights, let's concede the terms of the debate to the people who want us dead, or want to control us or our bodies, and just talk about healthcare in general in some universalistic terms, and somehow that'll magically lead to winning those rights back for us. But if you're not actually fighting for the thing, you're just surrendering it with better manners. Because history shows that every major civil rights advance in the US, be it queer, trans, racial, feminist, or any other, come from those who demand to be seen as fully human against the system that denied them that fact. The people who refused to wait their turn. The reforms that followed upon these demands never delivered everything that they sought for, but their demand for autonomy outside the limits set for them by the system reshaped that system. It was never the system coming down from on high and giving it to them on a schedule. They demanded the schedule be moved up.
But I am somebody. I may be on welfare, but I am somebody.
Jesse Jackson helped lead the fight against segregation and racism in the South. What he did as the first major African-American candidate in the history of this country was to put together a coalition which he named the Rainbow Coalition. He came to Vermont. I'm proud we supported him back then. He won Vermont and a number of other states, including the state of Michigan.
And I think that is such a self-defeating and counterproductive approach.
But McBride's alignment with institutional power over trans solidarity isn't accidental here. She exists, as I said, as a function to reassure liberals like Klein, both by her rhetoric and her words and her identity, that progress is on schedule. It's how she got her position in the first place. She was safe and useful to power.
Sarah McBride is a courageous young leader, and she is right now
the first trans person ever to address a national convention. Sarah?
Because everywhere else, besides being a trans person, McBride upholds America's systemic violence towards others, perhaps best exemplified by her open support of Israel.
Hi, I'm Sarah McBride, member of Congress from the great state of Delaware. And today and every day, I'm proud to stand with U.S. allies, with U.S. democratic allies, including the state of Israel, in the global struggle between authoritarianism.
McBride may personally face transphobia within the halls of power, but outside of her trans identity, she remains largely insulated from the consequences of the fascist systems she helps uphold due to her economic class and alignment with institutional power, thus allowing her to perpetuate harm in exchange for maintaining her own position. Her class position, her education, her whiteness, her professional background, these are the primary markers of belonging in the halls of political power in America. Her transness is framed as an exception layered on top of an otherwise acceptable identity, at least acceptable until it's not and can be used for political points. In other words, she is allowed in because she already looks and behaves like the kind of person the system was designed to include. She signals to mainly white trans people that we can align ourselves with the dominant narratives of success and respectability. That if we just work hard enough, if we learn to speak the institution's language fluently, if we just assimilate, we too can be welcomed into its fold.
I think this win is a testament to Delawareans that here in our state of neighbors, we are judging candidates based on their ideas and not their identities.
It offers a version of trans inclusion that accepts the terms of power rather than interrogating them. Because our legitimacy is framed as something we can earn through participating in the very systems that marginalize us, we are asked to shrink ourselves to fit inside of them. It turns our energy for seeking liberation into aspirational assimilation. This is white transness getting folded back into the whiteness and class privilege of the elite. And instead of asking how to dismantle the structures that demand our smallness, so we can actually be ourselves and fight for a life that feels worth living, we are pushed into proving we deserve our place, becoming instruments of the same machinery that harms us, so long as we are not the ones currently being harmed in that moment. This is the upper class core of liberal frameworks around trans rights. It is a trans person's right to seek assimilation into the American dream of accumulating wealth and power to exploit others, rather than liberation for all. Take how phrases like protect the dolls have recently become commodified hollow slogans for liberals to wear like moral accessories. I mean, to me, the phrase protect the dolls has always made me somewhat uncomfortable because it implies a kind of marketable version of trans femininity that fits our view of normal. A doll, as they say. Cis-passing, upper-class, white, pretty, a kind of Barbie version of trans femininity that can easily be sold to voters. To paraphrase an excellent essay by Abigail Thorne that you should all go read, are trans sex workers dolls? How about homeless trans women? Are Palestinian trans women dolls? What about black or indigenous trans women? What about trans women taken by ICE? Are they dolls? Hell, are conventionally unattractive trans women dolls? Are fat trans women dolls? And even further, are trans men and non-binary people even considered under this phrase that somehow now become interchangeable with trans rights? Even beyond Abigail Thorne's essay, the word doll to me has always denoted a hierarchy of ownership. It means we become something to be displayed, handled, adored, but never allowed to move on our own. So even the dollness of trans femininity that we're protecting is just decoration, docility, something pleasant enough for power to use, maybe even masturbate to, but never to fear. This is the vision of trans womanhood that liberal politicians so often fight for when they talk about trans rights. Our right to assimilate, to be palatable, to fit into a system that will never love us, only use us. And it's why both right-wing trans women like Blair White and assimilationist liberals like Sarah McBride, or the more openly Zionist Brianna Wu, cling to the same logic. They frame so-called trans women who don't fit in, the ones deemed too ugly, too poor, too defiant, too brown, too queer, too disabled, too unwilling to submit to the capitalist gender norms, as not really trans or authoritarian leftists seeking purity politics because we don't seek assimilation. While McBride is too civil to say this openly, the power structures that she's ultimately upholding are doing the same thing. While someone like Blair White or Brianna Wu will say it more openly.
Just no one who looks like this, I would avoid them like the plague. If I saw them coming, I would go the other way. Like, you just kind of have to know that people who look like this, you look at the eyes.
But all of them are either implicitly or explicitly saying that their version of transness only counts when it props up the hierarchies that the very concept of trans people, people who can move between supposedly natural hierarchies of gender, inherently prove are artificially created. It creates a trans femininity that is legible and non-threatening, one that can even be used against black and brown or Muslim or any non-conforming woman in the way white femininity more generally can be weaponized for power, as we see with white women Karens or TERFs like J.K. Rowling. Transness, then stripped of its radical defiance of the system just by inherently existing, becomes a pantomime of power dressed up as progress and an acceptable bargaining chip in exchange for the system's survival when it needs to, because ultimately it's upholding the larger system of capital and whiteness. And this, I think, returning to him, is the heart of Ezra Klein's existential crisis. Because for all of my critiques of him as a functionary of a system, there is something deeply human happening in this conversation. You can hear it every time Coates tries to get Klein to see that seeking common ground with fascists, people who are not rational political actors, means abandoning those already under attack and who have been under attack by the system since its inception. Klein continually repeats this question: what should I do? And it exposes the emptiness of his moral framework.
If you think it is okay to dehumanize people, then conversation between you and I is probably not possible.
And so what do you do with the fact that so many people think that is okay?
Klein genuinely cannot imagine a world where trans rights or any marginalized group's rights aren't negotiable, because they've always been on the table and in fact must be, in order for him to fulfill his role in giving more power to capital, to keep the wheels of the system moving. He can't act outside that system's limits because those limits have become the edges of his imagination. Anything else outside those limits either leads to authoritarian dystopia or Mad Maxian-style anarchy, which is not real anarchy, but we'll get to that.
I think you do have a line. I'm
sure I do.
I think there are things, for instance, that I could say that would make you say it's no point in Ta-Nehisi coming up on and being on this podcast. And likewise, there are things you could say, obviously, that I would say it's no point in me talking to Ezra.
Yeah. I'm saying, what happens if 35% of the country, 40% of the country, the dominant political force in the country is inside that? Does that change anything? Or no, like the line just holds?
No, I mean, welcome to Black America. That's our history. The line we have drawn in general has not been majoritarian politics, unfortunately.
Coates is trying to break Klein's illusion, to make him see the gulf between his faith in American institutions and the reality of how those systems Klein venerates maintain stability by sacrificing marginalized people on the altar of unity, and their sacrifice and suffering is the price of national harmony. It was never a vessel of inevitable progress, but a machine for managing power, occasionally widening who gets to hold on to it, but always at the discretion of those who already do. And when that power feels threatened, the same system offers the means to seize it back from those it had given to. Coates illustrates this clearly with the history of Black oppression.
I have a tradition. I have ancestry. I have heritage. What that means is that I do whatever I do within the time that I have in my life, whatever time I'm gifted with. And much of what I do is built on what other people did before then. And then after that, I leave the struggle where I leave it, and then hopefully it's in a better place. Oftentimes it's not. That's the history, in fact.
For the very basic right to vote in our country, there's seemingly an endless chain of violence.
And then my progeny pick it up and they keep it going. I am descended from people who in their lifetime fought with all their might for the destruction of chattel slavery in this country. And they never saw it. They never saw it. In my personal belief system, they died in, defeat, in darkness, And so I guess the privilege that I draw out of this, the honor that I draw out of this, is not that things will necessarily be better in my lifetime, but that I will make the contribution that I am supposed to make. The fact of the matter is, as horrifying as, that the killing of Charlie Kirk was, and as horrifying as the feeling is, this moment that we are in, an era of political violence, and I don't want to sound flip here, political violence is the norm for the Black experience in this country.
I mean, before the Civil War, America upheld slavery. But even afterwards, it had the chance to build something new, but instead remade its hierarchies through Jim Crow, redlining, and countless other systemic violences that were designed to preserve the old order under new names.
The reason why we go back to Reconstruction and the Civil War is because it is, before the 1960s, the only glimpse at the possibility of a real democracy in this country. And it happened. And in some places, it was actually quite successful. You know, you have people who, you know, had been enslaved, who are written off as illiterate fools, who, you know what I mean, serving in legislatures. And actually, you know, with the standard of the time, actually, it's such a hopeful, incredible story. It's a beautiful thing. And it was violently destroyed.
For a fleeting moment known as Reconstruction, it seemed possible that the United States might transcend its origins, that from the ashes of civil war, a genuine multicultural democracy could emerge, one envisioned by Black Americans even if the Founding Fathers could not. Led by Black activists and a Republican Party momentarily radicalized by the violent instigants of the White South, the years immediately following emancipation saw the most profound expansion of human and civil rights this nation has ever achieved. But the vision was short-lived. In the wake of Lincoln's assassination, the fragile promise of Reconstruction was systemically dismantled, eroded through terror and compromise and white backlash until it calcified into the regime of Jim Crow that then morphed into other less overt economic but still segregationist policies and practices, like the practice of redlining. America itself was founded to protect the property of white slave owners, with Black people themselves defined as property, a hinge point where humanity was negotiable, counted only when it served white political power, 3/5 at a time.
The problem exists because white people think they're better than Black people, and they want to oppress us, and they want us to allow ourselves to be oppressed.
This is I agree with you perfectly. This is the basic problem.
Then what do you
that white
talk to me
people
about?
think they're better
What is it
than
that I can
others?
do? I can't solve the problem. You guys pull the strings that close schools. You guys draw the boundaries that keep our kids restricted to the ghetto. You guys write up the restrictive covenants that keep us out of houses. So it's up to you to talk to your brothers and your sisters and persuade them that they have a responsibility. We've assumed ours for over 400 years, and we're tired of this kind of stuff now. We're not going to suffer patiently anymore. No more turning the other cheek. No more blessing our enemies. No more praying for those who despitefully use us. We're going to show you that we've learned the lessons you've taught us. We've studied your history, and you did not take over this country by singing "We Shall Overcome." You did not gain control of the world like you have it now by dealing fairly with a man and keeping your word. You're treaty breakers, you're liars, you're thieves, you rape entire continents and races of people. Then you wonder why these very people don't have any confidence or trust in you. Your religion means nothing. Your law is a farce, and we see it every day. You demonstrated it in Alabama. And I can say you because you're part of the whole system. You profit from it. In fact, you make your living from it.
As a Black man, Coates is far more attuned to this history.
They're part of my audience. And I would say an important part of my audience is people who have never enjoyed that respect. You know what I mean? People who, in fact, are subjects of the kind of hate that Charlie Kirk was harvesting. When I read his words towards trans people, Jesus. When I read, you know what I mean, the language towards Haitians specifically, which was very, very, Haitians will become your masters if you don't elect Trump. I mean, this is very, very familiar to me. You know, it's this idea of Haitians coming into the country or immigrants raping your daughters. I mean, this was really, really, really dark stuff. It's at the core of this country.
And yet, I do think that Coates still believes in the possibility of reform. Throughout the interview, he upholds the idea that we've been to dark places before as a country, but that he still believes that it is part of his job to keep fighting for America to confront its own history, honestly, and hopes that it can still evolve into something better. And his belief that that acknowledgement can lead to repair, even within the architecture of a system that was built to dehumanize people like him.
For us, and for those of us who ground ourselves in a larger tradition, this is not close. Like, this is a, you know, remarkable time, you know, in terms of our freedom, you know, as writers and journalists to speak to people, in terms of the amount of people who are empowered and have some amount of privilege and could just look away and are not looking away. You know, it's not a great time politically. You understand what I'm saying? But it's just, it's not the worst either.
No, it's not.
It's not the worst, you know?
And this is a debate that has existed long within Black political thought, the debate over the best path towards liberation. I mean, you can trace it back to figures like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, whose disagreements over things like seeking economic self-sufficiency or gradual assimilationism reflected deeper divides over how freedom could be achieved for Black Americans.
To those of my race who underestimate the importance of cultivating friendly relations with a southern white man who is their next door neighbor, I would say, cast down your bucket where you are.
Startled the nation to hear a Negro advocating such a program of accommodation after decades of our people's complaints. I thought at the time that the Atlanta Compromise could be a step toward reaching a real settlement between blacks and whites throughout the South. Of course, the hardening of white attitudes and the blacks' subsequent loss of voting rights throughout the region killed any chance of that.
This is a conversation, though, that continues to echo well into today, and one that creators like FD Signifier have explored far more thoroughly than I can. But this pull between assimilation, reform, and revolution has shaped not only black political thought, but nearly every marginalized group's politics in America to some level. Queer communities, too, for example, have wrestled with the same question, whether equality can be found within existing institutions and assimilating to them, or whether liberation requires imagining a new world beyond them. But while Klein and Coates both share this reformist belief, Klein ultimately doesn't understand the larger context of historical violence that Coates carries so personally. And so, for Klein, it's not as realistic, but more religious. That West Wing fantasy of procedural decency and inevitable progress.
Sometimes I think that having a historical scope that wide can make the present too deterministic.
And that is ultimately what this conversation between the two exposes. Coates' belief is tempered by history, while Klein's is insulated by privilege. One understands that the system will try to kill you even when you try to fix it. The other still thinks it just needs to be loved harder.
I think one of the things I've thought about is the need to actually raise the status of just like old-fashioned politics. And I think I've been surprised to find myself feeling that way. But I think one way the second Trump term has changed me is I don't, and maybe you always believe this, right? You know, I'm not putting this on you. I think what got built, for all of its flaws in the back half of the 20th century, was much more fragile than I'd understood. Not just like the legislation or any of that, but the actual sense of like what you could and could not do, what we would and would not accept. And I've just like the sense that we can just tumble all the way back has become much more real to me.
My boy Kipo wants to join us for this one. He was meowing at my feet. Which I think it's a good moment, because despite my endless critique of Klein here, I do empathize with what he's going through. I recognize the cognitive dissonance he's wrestling with because, frankly, I went through it too, and it was very difficult and painful. Just like Klein, I grew up cushioned by privilege as well. I was white, middle class, and I was treated as a boy who had every door open for my future. And certainly inside, I was a trans woman with no words yet for myself, and that caused much of its own pain. But I was also, at the same time, taught by everyone around me, had it ingrained into me that progress was inevitable, that goodness was baked into our system, that the future would always, always improve. I mean, hell, as a Trekkie, I believed that the Star Trek future was inevitable, that if we just kept moving forward, America's technocratic optimism and liberal institutions would slowly carry us to a sort of utopia of flying starships and endless abundance. And when it came out as trans during the Obama years, I felt like that dream was becoming real. Gay marriage was legalized. Trans people were becoming more visible. History was finally turning a corner. And then 2016 hit. Trump won, and when that happened, I just sat there crying, realizing I wasn't the future. I was a target. That illusion cracked really for the first time for me. The system wasn't progressing towards justice, it was protecting itself. And that moment started my own personal journey to recognize all the things that I had been taught to ignore, that I had had the privilege to ignore. All the people, all the struggles, all the history that I had been asked to see as just part of the inevitable progress, or had it pushed aside or ignored. The history that was getting crushed and erased, my own history as a trans person, and the history of so many communities. And I learned that a utopian future is not inevitable, but simply a dream that you aspire to fight for. That's why we articulate utopias. To create a vision of what we are reaching for. Something new. To make us all have a chance at a happier life. To reach for better. To fight for better for those you love. But liberalism always finds a way to try to sell a utopia as inevitable, so long as we just stay on track and don't rock the boat too much. Stay civil. Because fundamentally, the only future that it can envision is the one that looks just like the present. One built on the already existing power structures of the present day. Take out when Klein is confronted in another episode of his podcast to present and offer a utopian statement about liberalism. What he offers up is that sort of technologically driven Star Trekian future.
I want you to say something utopian about the future that you think progressives should build.
I believe technology can dramatically transform human life for the better. Dramatically. I think it can make possible ways of living. I think it can solve problems that we take as completely inevitable and totally for granted. I think that we should be able to deliver dramatic changes to public infrastructure quickly. I think we should be able to build things. And I think when the government promises you something, from high-speed rail to a subway extension to a national electric vehicle charger network, that thing should emerge. It should be gleaming. It should happen quickly. It should be like, oh my fucking God, the government did that.
But when Klein is confronted on what this technocratic utopia, based on the trust of Silicon Valley technocrats to get us there, actually offers us, he can't really articulate it. He instead returns to heteropatriarchal values of 2 kids and a family. It's a reproductive futurism that just returns us to reproducing the familiar power structures of our present day, not imagining anything else for anyone else.
You need something else in the horizon besides saying, we're going to be inclusive and we're going to get rich together with flying cars. You need to say, so that we can live in some specific way that we are supposed to live. What is that way, Ezra Klein? How then shall we live?
My friend, I am a liberal. I actually believe in creating a space for liberal individual flourishing of different kinds. I don't find it to be some great countercultural thing to say you should have a family. I have 2 children. I talk about it on my show all the time. I am a left pronatalist. I don't believe it has been a great advantage of the rights in politics. Some of their people say it's good to be a dad, and nor do I believe it's a great advantage of mine. I think that if you want to see, like, Obama is good at the politics of a family, and Pete Buttigieg is better at it than anybody currently on the right, because I think to him, it is a more remarkable thing that he has children and he has a husband than it is to anyone virtually in national politics. So hold on.
But Buttigieg and Obama are both in liberal, left-wing progressive ways steeped in the language of Christianity.
I think this is the limit of his imagination. A future that looks exactly like the present, just with shinier toys and flying cars and rocket ships. I mean, I like cool technology too, but we are living in a moment that makes the truth painfully clear that technology does not liberate us from the structures of the present. It only intensifies them if we let them stay in the hands of those who hold power.
You would prefer the human race to endure, right? You're hesitating.
Yeah, well,
Yes?
I don't know. I would.
This is a long hesitation. This is a long hesitation.
There's so many questions implicit in this.
Should the human race survive?
I mean, someone like Bill Gates can claim that AI will let us all work only 2 days a week, but under capitalism and emerging techno-feudalism, where survival itself is tied to labor, fewer work days doesn't mean more time for living, they just mean more time in precarity. More time being surveilled and managed, as Larry Ellison wants. More time watching the world burn, while Elon Musk flies off to Mars and Mark Zuckerberg hides in his bunker. If the future is built with the same values as the present, just with newer technology, it will not save us.
You do have a bunker there. Is there something you know that we don't?
No, I think that's just like a little shelter under, and it's like a basement.
A little shelter? What are you worried about?
It's a basement.
American liberalism continually tells the story that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice, ultimately using Martin Luther King Jr.'s own words as a way to erase his later demands for revolution, so that they instead can become a bedtime story for the ones who are almost inside.
We are here today because Wall Street has a critical role to play in fulfilling
Dr. King's dream of opportunity for all Americans.
It's seductive, especially when you're close enough to believe the system might still save you. Be patient, it says. The system will self-correct.
That although history does not travel in a straight line, it moves in the direction of justice.
Even backlash like Trump's first term against the Obama years becomes just another part along that long arc of history. Biden's 2020 election was framed as a restoration of that faith, the proof in the pudding, as it were. The promise that the system has stumbled but would right itself again.
American history is not a fairy tale. Thomas Jefferson wrote what many believe to be the most important document in human history. He was a slaveholder. We've never lived up to our American ideals. Jefferson himself didn't. But what he wrote has pulled us towards justice for more than 2 centuries.
But it hasn't. Instead, we keep watching the system slide further into fascism faster and more brazenly. But it's not a glitch, but a logical outcome. Because, to me, fascism isn't the opposite of liberalism. It's what emerges when the hierarchies buried within the liberal institutions awaken again. The ones etched into its bones by centuries of empire, patriarchy, colonialism, and profit.
They used to say, to the victor belong the spoils. Well, we'd be the victor that would leave, because we had people that didn't know what the hell they were doing.
It's the system remembering what it was built to do, to sort, to rank, to order, to control. Fascism has arrived not as a rupture, but a way for the system to try to return once it realizes that inclusion threatens the powerful and has become too costly. The mask of civility slips and the machinery beneath it hums to life, doing what it was always designed to do: protect power from the people. Fascism's project is to violently expunge whatever doesn't conform to our ingrained beliefs of what normal is, to reimpose those taught hierarchies through blood and control. Be it about gender, be it about race, be it about property, be it about sex. And if we keep letting it turn its gears, fascism will finish its project, whether it's in 4 years or 40 or 400, and it will have done exactly what it was built to do: erase those deemed inconvenient to the system's functioning and restore the dominance of those who profit from it. And when it's all over and fascism is beaten and fought away, the comfortable will look back and mourn with clean hands, walking over the bones of the ground up, whispering, how terrible all of this was, and how sad it was that so many had to die before we learned to fight back, as if they hadn't lived through most of it untouched. Or, as Omar Akkad titled his book, that was a haunting reflection on Western liberalism's complicity in Israel's genocide in Palestine,
one day, everyone will have always been against this.
This is why, despite the empathy that I feel for him, I fundamentally don't know if Ezra Klein will ever truly reconcile his dissonance about liberalism's harm, because he's also at the same time a liberal Zionist. And we've certainly seen how much cognitive dissonance that belief takes to hold right now. Liberal Zionists may denounce Netanyahu as a fascist leader. They may even condemn the carnage in Gaza. Hell, they may even call what's happening in Gaza a genocide at moments.
I do not see a defense that Israel's not guilty of, at this point, war crimes and crimes against humanity. But the debate has centered around this question of genocide.
But they still rest their politics on Israel's inherent right to exist.
Debates about Israel often circle the same strangely posed question: does Israel have the right to exist? The question is engineered to trap the conversation in the past rather than capture the urgency of the present. Israel does exist. The question is not whether Israel has the right to exist, it is whether Israel has the right to dominate.
Zionism has worn many faces throughout the years. It's had socialist parties, liberal parties, conservative parties, fascist parties, but they all remain on the same spectrum built on the fundamental premise that the Jewish ethno-state's existence is inherently self-justifying. And that belief sets the limits of the debate, the limits of the imagination, limits which fall well outside of questioning the state's foundational ideology, an ideology that requires the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in order to bring into being. Within Zionism, you can debate anything except that. And the moment someone pushes against that core belief, they get labeled an extremist. Not a person worth engaging with, not someone to debate, just someone to be dismissed, to push outside. And when they raise their voices in order to be heard, they're called violent. And when they defend themselves, they're called terrorists.
there's an impossible demand made of the Palestinians to be, for lack of a better expression, perfect victims to portray themselves in this with this ethnocentric civility that adheres to Western guidelines. Otherwise, they would be deserving of death. They would be deserving of being bombed. And to reject this is to say that the Declaration of Human Rights is unconditional and it's universal. And to reject this is to say that we believe in dignity. We don't believe in having to shrink ourselves or to perform a different script in order to be awarded freedom and dignity. These are things we are entitled to.
Meanwhile, some like Netanyahu commit daily acts of violence, such as his recent breaking of the ceasefire to kill 50 children. 50 children is seen as legitimate state violence. Civil.
Compared to most outlets, I've had a fairly wide range of opinion on Israel on the show. And I've had everyone from right-wing Israeli commentators to actual Hamas apologists. And that's because it's not really representative.
Ezra, why is one group right-wing advocates, or what you just said, and the other group Hamas apologists?
What do you mean?
Like, why are they not right-wing apologists?
They're right-wing apologists.
Yeah, that's just not what you just said. Like, you called the Hamas folks, and I'm not saying they're not apologists.
When I say I've had right-wing Israelis on, I mean people who support Netanyahu, not people who support Ben Gvir and Smotrich. I do not put... Hamas is a complicated organization. Right. I've tried to treat it on the show as a complicated organization.
Right. I know you have.
It did spend many, many years specifically targeting killing civilians. I take that as different.
You take that different than Netanyahu?
I take that as different than Netanyahu, yeah.
All this creates a grim, secular choreography. Zionism's militant wing seizes control and then enacts more violence, and then it's eventually forced to restrain itself. There are expressions of remorse and regret, even as Israel has now consolidated more territory and power as tens of thousands, if not more, Palestinians lay dead. Over the decades, this endlessly repeating cycle has kept continuing and will continue until either every Palestinian is dead or gone, or the system itself is destroyed. Because it's a decaying spiral, and the liberal comfort to reform later, always later, only helps sell to keep it turning. But here's the thing that I desperately want you all to understand. Zionism's ideological apparatus isn't unique to it. It runs on the same logic of hierarchy and exceptionalism that built the American project. In both countries, you either belong as a useful cog, you have your identity shaved down to fit the wheel, or you're disposable. And if you speak up for your own life and autonomy, instead of folding into that machine, you're recast as the enemy. And while the moderates look away, the fascists in power, be it Trump or Netanyahu, will line up to kill you, leaving you with no one to defend you. At least that's how the system wants it to be. Klein's liberal Zionism mirrors his liberalism more broadly, a faith in the possibility of reform within systems structurally incapable of justice because they weren't built on a foundation that seeks to uphold justice. It tells the same story, that inclusion is coming, that progress is inevitable, and that someday everyone will get a seat at the table. But for those of us whose lives are lived outside of that inevitable progress, we never get to see that future because it does not exist. We're just the ones the eternal present is built over. Fascism purges and destroys in the name of purity, and then liberalism arrives as the hero to restore order, the Luke Skywalker who has come to save us all. And in doing so, solidifies and normalizes the new status of encroaching power that fascism gave it. And in this endless dance, they maintain the same architecture of control, the very same hierarchies of whose lives are livable, whose dreams are acceptable, and whose futures are imaginable. The American establishment is built to punish imagination itself, to condemn anyone who dares to dream beyond its borders. It survives by making alternatives seem unthinkable, by branding every vision of something greater as something dangerous or naive. Because those alternatives are the only true threat to its power, the only way to end fascism not just in this iteration, but in every cycle to come. So the system vilifies those who try to imagine a world beyond, who gesture at something new, because every act of imagination becomes framed as extremism, and every demand for transformation is chaos. At a recent event promoting 107 Days, her memoir about her failed presidential campaign, because if you can't be president, you might as well get a book deal, Kamala Harris was confronted by pro-Palestinian protesters. They shouted over her, calling out her complicity in enabling the genocide of Palestinians through continued U.S. weapon sales under the Biden administration. Harris, visibly angry, shouted back over them.
I hate that. The same person that was telling people not to vote?
It's such a revealing response, isn't it? Because what she's really saying there is it's your fault I didn't get elected. Not hers at all, no. Not her failure to act. Not her complicity in the Biden administration's support of Israel's genocide. Not the moral rot of a system that supports said genocide while insisting that it stands for equality. No! It's the fault of those who refuse to participate in that system that's killing people. It's their fault. And that resentment that she's trying to build works, right? We all get why, because I'll admit it, I felt that resentment. I've caught myself seething at the people who refuse to vote or who picked a third party. Because right now, I'm the one losing access to my health care because I'm a trans person. I'm the one being labeled a terrorist for simply being myself. I'm the one afraid for my life just for existing as a trans person right now. And there's a part of me that screams every day, oh God, I scream, if only they'd realize that yes, both Trump and Kamala would have supported the genocide, but at least Kamala would have given me time to breathe, time to prepare, time to live. Me. Only me. And when that bitterness comes up, I remind myself, the failure isn't on the people who didn't vote. Because if Kamala Harris had actually spoken up, if she had done anything to signal a real change in the Biden administration's policy towards Israel, or frankly, in any way, in anything, she might have earned those votes. Maybe it would have been enough to win, maybe not. Maybe the racism and misogyny embedded in this country's core beliefs would still have doomed her campaign. The system was never built for a black woman like her to gain power, and the system would have reasserted itself regardless, either during her presidency or after. But either way, the failure to court the pro-Palestinian vote is hers and hers alone. And it is not their fault that we are currently living under fascism. It is not the fault of people refusing to participate in a system built on trying to make you feel complicit in its violence. The fault lies with those who mistake moral outrage for bad politics. To those like Kamala who try to build resentment towards the very people who are fighting and gesturing at a new future. To quote Omar Akkad,
after chiding activists who warned years ago of the Republican Party's descent into outright fascism, mainstream Democrats have now fully embraced the accusation. It's become difficult to find a single Democratic campaign appeal that doesn't lean hard on the warning that the Trump wing of the GOP, which is now the only viable wing of the GOP, represents an existential threat to democracy, the United States itself. Fight it, then propose something to meet the nature of the movement. It can't be the case that the Supreme Court is both an unaccountable neoconservative body intent on rendering the whole country unrecognizable, and that there is simply no way to do anything significant about it. It can't be that the climate is the single most important issue facing the world, with our entire species at risk, and drilling licenses need to continue. It can't be that innocent Palestinians have faced unbearable suffering and we care very deeply about their plight, and absolutely nothing will stop the arming of the nation responsible. It can't be both rhetorical urgency and policy-making impotence.
Democrats continually rely on being less monstrous than the Republicans, protecting their power by keeping the ever so slightly higher moral high ground, even as the ground itself sinks beneath them. And as a white trans woman, I sit at this strange crossroads within the dynamic. I am both a target of systemic harm right now, and also a beneficiary of whiteness and class within liberal politics. That's why, in a way, I understand someone like Ezra Klein. I'm able to do that, because I once believed in that same system, that if I played by the rules, I could belong in it. But as I read Omar Akkad's recent book, I saw him say this.
What the mainstream Democrat seems incapable of accepting is that, for an even remotely functioning conscience, there exists a point beyond which relative harm can no longer offset absolute evil. For a lot of people, Genocide is that point. Suddenly, another very persuasive argument takes on a different meaning. Vote for the liberal though he harms you because the conservative will harm you more starts to sound a lot like vote for the liberal though he harms you because the conservative might harm me too. In reality, not a single Western politician or party, not a single government anywhere in the world can be expected to change when constantly rewarded this way. The argument in favor of voting for the lesser evil is frequently made in good faith by people who have plenty to lose should the greater evil win, but it also establishes the lowest of benchmarks. Want my vote? Be less monstrous than the monster.
Personally, I completely agree with everything in that quote, but at the same time, I also have to admit that I'm called out in his words, because I made that same good faith argument to vote that he describes there. Right here on this very channel, I made a video calling for people to vote for Kamala, and my argument was exactly as Omar describes. It was, I don't like Kamala, I think she's awful, and I know there's a genocide going on, but both Kamala and Trump support it, and right now, the Trump administration is targeting me, targeting my healthcare, my ability to live as a trans person. And personally, I made that argument not to support Kamala. I am and always have been anti-state. I personally argued that voting was not a means of choosing the lesser evil, but choosing the conditions we organize under. And for me, a Kamala presidency wouldn't have meant I would just sit around doing nothing and be complacent. It would have meant I would have had a little more space to breathe and thus more energy and time to help others fight to survive. Energy that I don't have much now because I'm trying to survive myself. Nor do those of my comrades sitting in ICE detention facilities or being targeted right now. But I also, at the same time, understand how privilege shapes who even gets that kind of breathing room. And I understand why people would hear someone like me, who looks like me, say that and think, you just want to be safe, and you don't care who pays the price. Because from where they're standing, it sounds like complicity. And that's exactly how the system wants it to sound. The system is designed to pit us against each other, to make a desire to survive look like betrayal, or to try to make us choose our own safety over someone else's. And certainly, white trans women sometimes align, consciously or not, with the incentives the system dangles in front of us through assimilating through our whiteness, giving us access, power, and a nominal illusion of safety. That bargain shapes how some even look at the genocide within my community and makes them say, we can't change this, we just have to work within the system. Try and change what we can. That feeling was in large part the doomerism that ContraPoints was describing in her essay on Zionism that rightfully upset a lot of people. Because ultimately it revealed her belief that there is no world outside of liberalism, no future beyond managing harm in her eyes. But we can imagine more, we can do more. That's not the whole of us. It doesn't have to be our story because we are not hopeless, we are not powerless, and we have other avenues to fight for our survival. And we do not have to disappear ourselves to survive. Because most trans women, most people, are scraping by, exhausted, yet still showing up, standing with other marginalized people because we realize we are all free or none of us are. The system teaches us to resent each other for the choices we make under pressure instead of naming the real enemy, the machine that is the pressure cooker that makes us choose, the one that convinces us that safety is a privilege, not a right, that realism means stopping fighting for more and just accepting what we have, and that our anger is the problem instead of evidence that we still care, that we're still human. But when I say all of this, a lot of people often ask me, well, what's your vision for better, Jesse? And I've spoken a lot about my belief in the necessity for outreach in your own local communities, how that's the most important thing you can be doing, as well as my belief in anarchism, a system that certainly has its own flaws, but I also know is better than this system of oppression built to serve only the powerful, because it would fundamentally serve us. But if you're curious about that, read some of these books for more. Or if you're a sci-fi fan, read some Ursula K. Le Guin. The Dispossessed is a fantastic book to start with, and it articulates an anarchistic utopia while also critiquing it at the same time. But at the end of the day, the revolution is not going to be televised or read in a book. What you need to do is go out and see what your community is doing. See what it needs and fulfill that need. Get involved in organizations or anti-ICE movements or mutual aid or something else. Because at the end of the day, theory is great, as it can give you words and a framework for what you want. And YouTube videos like this can be inspiring, but the real work to make something new requires you to actually act. That truly is most central to a vision of better, to act as if we are already living in that new tomorrow. That's how we create a new future, by trying every day to enact it even in the smallest of ways, in the small, everyday gestures between us. Because one day, if we act as if the future is here and ricochet it out through our community, then we'll create it. And ultimately, while I'm deeply cynical about the federal system here in the United States, the place where capital isn't just influential, but the very terms of participation, I'm ultimately not cynical about organizers like Zohran Mamdani and others working at the local and state level. They are ultimately accountable to people because that's how they built their campaigns. And that's exactly why Democrats in power are terrified of them.
Is part of the calculus that if you endorse a democratic socialist, you're worried it will be damaging to your party, maybe even your chances of winning back the Senate?
I'm going to continue talking to him. Dana, you can ask me again.
Because someone who owes their legitimacy to community instead of donors can't be easily managed or neutralized. And ultimately, we're going to have to see what happens as Mamdani gains more political capital within this machinery, whether he'll be forced to bend to it, to feed it, or whether he can continue to resist its gravity. But regardless of the outcome, his campaign has already proved something undeniable. People want a politics not organized around hierarchy and extraction, but around each other. I ultimately believe the system is self-preserving, and when socialists enter the Democratic Party, they're often pressured to contort themselves to fit the existing order, and it almost never bends in return. And yet, I do believe that reformers still do essential work. They ease real suffering in the world we currently inhabit, while others build the scaffolding of life beyond the state. That push and pull between survival within what we have and dreaming towards what could be has always shaped the political imagination and discussions within disenfranchised people. But that's not a contradiction. That's the work. That's the actual dialectic that we should be focusing on. Not discussions with the powerful on their terms, but between ourselves on ours. Ezra Klein, though, is trapped somewhere else entirely. Still convinced the system can self-correct as long as we see every morality as transactional and every compromise as inherently virtuous. And we can see where his vision is going to lead us next. California Governor Gavin Newsom, the man currently trying to sell himself as the Democrats' 2028 presidential frontrunner, the supposed savior who will finally beat Trump and restore liberal order, recently vetoed 2 major AI regulation bills that were on his desk that Silicon Valley opposed. The bills would have helped curb the impact of the speculative AI bubble tech companies are intentionally inflating at the expense of working-class jobs in the years ahead. But he vetoed those bills because he ultimately was serving Silicon Valley. Meanwhile, at the same time, in order to combat Texas state legislators redistricting to solidify Republican power in the House of Representatives, Gavin Newsom has moved to get California to do the same to solidify Democrat power in the House. And so we are asked to sacrifice our democracy to save our democracy. It's the only options that we're given. It's the only thing we're allowed to imagine. He also vetoed a bill that would have allowed transgender people, and anyone using hormone therapy, because it's not just trans people using hormone therapy, to maintain a 12-month supply of our HRT medications. The bill was designed as a safeguard to protect access to HRT for trans people amid federal crackdowns and supply disruptions, a simple piece of legislation that would have explicitly recognized gender identity in healthcare protection law in the face of Trump's attempts to ban and outlaw trans healthcare. For many trans people, Gavin Newsom's veto of that bill means more than any of the performative pro-LGBTQ bills he signed. He could have actually materially helped us, and he refused. Yet when pressured on things like trans rights, Newsom immediately throws trans people under the bus and then pivots to, but I actually have the best record on trans rights of anyone.
Trans people and their families felt kind of thrown under the bus. So what exactly, when you said it was deeply unfair for them to participate,
Because I believe that.
What do you mean?
What is like unfair how and when and where?
Well, we've had the experience in California on multiple occasions.
So high school?
Yes, these track meets. And I've had to deal with it. Others haven't. I was trying to find a way to balance this because there's not one person you've ever had on air that has a better record on trans rights than this person you're talking to. Period, full stop. I have signed more bills protecting trans folks than anyone you've ever had on this air. I have appointed more people to positions of power and influence as it relates to trans than any other major elected official, from judicial appointments to a significant appointment I just made in terms of our retirement system just a few weeks ago. It's a point of pride that I've done that.
And sure, that may even be true, because there's not exactly a good record from Democrat liberals on trans rights to begin with. But at the end of the day, he's not defending trans people, he's not defending the working class. He's defending his own power. It's the same liberal move we've seen over and over again. Sacrifice marginalized people in the working class, then just congratulate yourself for being the least cruel one in the room.
While discussing his years in the Senate earlier this week, Biden said he worked alongside segregationist senators to, quote, get things done and with civility. Biden says the point he was trying to make is that Washington functioned more smoothly a generation ago than under today's hyper-partisanship. New Jersey Senator Cory Booker says Biden should apologize.
Cory should apologize. He knows better. There's not a racist bone in my body. I've been involved in civil rights my whole career.
Men like Gavin Newsom are the inevitable next step of Ezra Klein's vision. The liberal strongman who adopts the rhetoric of civility while normalizing the politics of control because he can win, and winning is all that matters. Not what you win or why you're fighting.
We got to win. Strength. Not holding hands, not having candlelight vigil, not writing an op-ed in response to Greg Abbott, not trying to make a point, but make a difference. These guys are consolidating power as we're trying to, express how right we are on issues.
He's a man whose performative opposition to Trump disguises his own project of consolidating power, of appeasing capital, of narrowing democracy through redistricting and privatization. He is the aesthetic of resistance, masking the substance of regression. Klein's obsession with consensus and his willingness to sacrifice trans rights and his blind faith in Silicon Valley's abundance all functions to prepare us for that world, a world where we exist as playthings for technocrats. Just another turning of the wheel, the same hierarchies, not an actual future. Because the system was never built to serve us, it was built to preserve itself, and no future can bloom inside its walls, only an endless decaying present. The only path forward is to imagine beyond them, to see past the horizon of the flag, past the language of empire, and past the myth of order itself. People like Ezra Klein are bound by the borders of both their minds and in the lines they draw on maps. We are not. We live on a horizon they cannot even imagine. Ezra Klein ends his op-ed with the line,
"We are all safe, or none of us are."
But black trans women murdered to protect someone else's sense of masculinity have never been safe. Immigrants snatched off the streets to keep things orderly have never been safe. Homeless people left to vanish in the cold have never been safe. Palestinians erased in the name of peace have never been safe. So I have to ask the question, safety for whom? And the answer is always the same. For those who make themselves palatable to power. And power's appetite is endless. It consumes and constricts until nothing remains. A serpent choking to death on its own tail. To walk toward the horizon of a new future means that we need to risk something. We must be willing to put our economic safety, our political safety, even our physical safety on the line for others. And if that's true, then it cannot also be true that we are all safe or none of us are. Because safety is not the measure of our humanity. Solidarity and community is. So the real truth is we are all liberated, or none of us are. Alrighty, interwebs, thank you so much for watching. I know this was another long one. I promise I will make short videos. I've been trying to do more of them. There's been a few here and there, and I will get better at it. There's just so much going on in my brain and so much going on. So thank you for sticking with me, and I hope this video was illuminating to all of you. Big thing that I just want to say, making these videos takes a lot of my time and energy, and I'm also working on many other projects, both on YouTube and outside of it. I'm excited to hopefully be able to announce some in the near future, but we'll get there when we get there. But to be able to do all of this, I do need to be able to pay my bills. And Patreon is easily the best place for you to support me doing that. I have some extra bonus videos and other fun stuff, and your name in videos and all that stuff if you go support me there. But any little bit on Patreon does really mean a lot to me. Not only me, to my partner and my 4 cats that we have, who I love to death, and also helps enable us to, we're currently trying to work to try to leave the country as well. So yeah, because it's not great here. So any support monetarily there does truly, truly, truly mean the world. It means a lot to me personally. Beyond that, don't forget to subscribe, all that fun stuff. I have a podcast called Frack This Podcast, which is a Battlestar Galactica rewatch podcast that you can check out. Should be on this channel, so look for that. It's called the Frack This Podcast again. Said Patreon, said subscribe. I'm on Nebula. Nebula's cool. All that stuff. But beyond all of that, I hope you, my friends, live long and prosper.